The protagonist had enough men to make her feel special. Each of them was different. Handsome with long white hair or with a short haircut and a love of flowers. One of the 10 was devout, praying almost always. The other had dark skin and looked different from the others. The other 2 were aristocrats, and their manners and style simply screamed wealth. All 10 of them were in love with one girl, the main character of this story, who amazed them with her beauty, leaving no chance of not falling in love. And here she was, Daisy Heidi, who had come here and was far from the main role. But she was smiling smugly because she knew the book by heart, so she had an advantage. She was now happy and dreamy because now she had bought a house and would earn money, and soon become rich and famous. But it didn't happen that way. They were just dreams, and the reality was different. She was not mentioned at all because she was poor and only noticed when she was sitting on the street leaning against the fence. Now she was washing the floors in her small poor house, trying to do everything right. But a noise caught her attention, and Daisy turned around, stopping what she was doing for a few seconds to notice the guests in her yard. Polyp was being led by 3 men wearing identical clothes, uniforms, that left no doubt as to who they were. He was crying, wiping his face with his hand and bowing his head. Dropping everything, she ran outside, calling her boyfriend and asking him what had happened. She was scared because it had never happened before and she did not know what he had done. Hovering over her was a handsome man who looked directly at the girl and asked her if she was Daisy Heidi. He was not smiling and was terrifying to look at. The girl opened her mouth, looking at him and feeling only one thing. Something ominous stirred inside her, warning her that nothing good would come of this visit. Everyone turned their attention to the sobbing Polyp, who called her name and wiped his eyes with his sleeves, saying he was sorry. The man in front of her, who had raised his voice a few seconds earlier, closed his eyes, apparently to calm himself. He confirmed that it was Daisy and told her that the Duke of Hanston was waiting for her. She couldn't believe it, shouting and asking questions, and Polyp's face immediately changed. He looked at Daisy in awe because she had been summoned to the Duke. The girl jumped up and down at the news. The men took her by the arms, dragging her to the carriage, while she resisted and asked why they were doing this. She knew that nothing good could come of this challenge. Polyp shouted for her not to worry, because he was the most noble aristocrat in town. He shouted for the girl to remember that he would not do anything illegal because he was too scared, and asked her to put in a good word for him. Resisting while the 2 men tried to cram her and the carriage in, Daisy shouted at the boy because it was unfair. He had done something, and they were taking her to the Duke. She looked out of the carriage window, lost in her own thoughts and furrowing her brow. She mentally promised to kick Polyp's arse when she returned from the Duke's estate. A silent man sat in front of the girl, and she looked at him and thought that there was probably no point in asking him anything, because he would not say anything anyway. The Duke of Hanston is the epitome of beauty and grace. White hair that sparkles under the Pontypool sun, pale and soft skin, and a cold-blooded personality. The girl was embarrassed. The Duke's status was so high that people like her or Polyp had never seen him, and the more questions she had about the reason for the call. She was also worried because the main character was his daughter, because it was from him that she received such genes that did not leave anyone indifferent. They drove up to a majestic and incredibly beautiful mansion that caught the eye of everyone who was even happy to be there. Great style, always blooming flower beds and gardens and fountains. Daisy was standing next to one of the men in front of the door of the Duke's office when he knocked and waited for an answer. As soon as they entered, he said he had brought Daisy, and the Duke ordered the servant to leave. The girl was frightened because she was standing so close to him and saw him with her own eyes. The Duke of Hanston sat with his back to the door. He was looking out the huge windows overlooking the garden, and the room itself looked luxurious. His house really did look like a mansion, just as big and beautiful. The girl fell to her knees, resting her palms on the carpet on the floor and bowing her head. She believed that bowing was the best course of action. When the girl refused to sit down and remained on her knees, he turned and, holding a paper in his hands, told her to listen to him carefully and answer only when he asked her something. Duke Hanston began to read, listing her age, the fact that she grew up without parents because she was abandoned, and that her hometown was unknown. Daisy bowed her head, closing her eyes and feeling a stab of pain from everything he was listing. The man came closer, stopping just centimeters from the girl's face. He asked her if she had worked at the Chenu restaurant on the pier, and she said that she was still working there. Sitting down in a chair with different armrests, he still held the piece of paper in his hand, calmly saying that she was no longer there because she had been fired today. This information surprised her, making her eyes glaze over in bewilderment. How did this happen? She drank a little too much while looking at the Duke. The girl was desperate, and it was evident from her behavior and reaction. The Duke propped his head up with his hand on the armrest and watched the girl in silence for several seconds, never taking his eyes off her. He looked bored while Daisy shook her head, explaining that she could only survive because of her job at the restaurant. The man threw something at her, saying it was her salary for the month, dropping the chain of the jewelry so that it flew to the girl. The pendant was very beautiful. The red stone sat in the heart of an atypical piece of jewelry, the smooth lines of which only complemented the beauty of the ruby. Daisy couldn't stop looking at the jewelry on the floor in front of her. She heard the Duke ask her if she recognized it, but her pampered eyes and the fear in them betrayed her. The Duke of Hanston said as he watched her that her stupid friend was trying to sell a piece of jewelry in a jewelry store. Rising from his seat, the Duke continued to speak, saying that the jeweler suspected the theft and turned to the Duke, and the boy began to tell him that it was Daisy who had given him the jewelry. He reminded us that the crime of selling stolen goods is a serious one, saying that he would never allow rats to even crawl around him. He stepped on the jewelry, breaking the pendant, but the stone remained under the Duke's shoe. He looked scary, hovering over the girl and asking her where she got the thing. Daisy stared at the same spot in front of her, still looking scared because the situation was not good. Her eyes were still trying to get out of their sockets as she heard the order. "Speak." Polyp shouted that he would wait for Daisy at home. He was still a child, and a crybaby, and a bit naive. He was just like his namesake, a colon polyp, impossible to get rid of because he was very clingy, but he was her only friend. The girl recalled how Polyp came running to her in tears, saying that he was in trouble. She was so surprised that she even stopped doing the laundry. The guy rushed towards her, but Daisy put her foot out to push him away, telling him not to come near her. She wrapped her arms around herself and told him to speak from where she had kicked him. Daisy was worried about what had happened and didn't want the boy to get too close. Sitting on the floor, Polyp began to complain that he didn't have the money to move in with his mother, telling her the story of the landlord who wouldn't return the deposit. Holding her head, the girl stretched her hand forward, stopping the guy's story and asking why she needed this information, since she had no money. But Polyp persisted, now asking why she didn't sympathize with him, because he and his mother were in trouble and friends should support each other. He began to cry for greater effect, which completely confused the girl. She looked at him as if she had never seen him before, and then she handed me the box, asking me to stop crying. When he opened it, Polyp saw a beautiful pendant with a complicated shape and a stone inside. The next moment, the girl was trying to restrain her friend, who was trying to reach out to hug her. She began to explain that the pendant should not be sold in a jewelry store, as he would be suspected of stealing it. And now she was sitting there thinking that Polyp was so stupid that he never listened to good advice, and that he was the reason she was in front of the Duke. Looking at the paper in his hands, the Duke said that the boy needed to buy a carriage for his girlfriend, but he was more interested in where the girl got the expensive jewelry from. Daisy began to tell me that she had bought the pendant at an auction and that it was not from the black market. But looking at the girl, the Duke of Hanston said that it was strange, because the owner of the pendant had died recently, and usually auctions of this level are held quickly and only among friends. Listening to the Duke, who did not believe her story, the girl's eyes bugged out. She was afraid of what would happen next. She said she would tell him everything from the beginning. The Duke, holding his chin, was pleased and ordered us to begin. With her head bowed and bent in front of her husband, Daisy began to tell him that there are many descriptions of the novel's protagonist, Faith Hanston. The Duke's attention was completely riveted on the girl, and he did not understand what she was talking about. But she told him everything, even his own memories, trying not to forget anything. With his head propped up on his hands and looking at the girl who was ready to answer all his questions, he asked one thing. What was the name of the novel they were in? The Duke was puzzled by the title, The Reason Why the Young Duchess Rolls Through the Pumpkin Fields, because his daughter had no reason to go near the fields. Daisy looked away in embarrassment, ashamed of the title since she had invented it. She was the author of that novel. Scratching the back of her head, she smiled, still embarrassed, as she said he was right and asked herself why she had given her creation such a name. The novel with this title had 10 writers. Friends wrote their ideas and fantasies into it, creating 10 male characters that each of them liked, but with one heroine. Explaining this to the Duke, Daisy said that she thought writing this novel would give her the satisfaction she wanted. But she only thought so. Folding her hands in a prayerful gesture, the girl said that one day she woke up in a novel she had written with her friends. Duke Hanston looked at the girl, asking her again if she was really saying that his daughter was the main character in the novel. Pleased with this, the Duke asked her to tell him what would happen to his daughter next, and Daisy was frightened. How could she tell him? She was in a panic. The heroine would become a cause of greed and pleasure, and this was something she could never tell her father. The Duke lost his smile that had been on his face recently. He heard that there was no happy ending to this story. Falling to the floor again, the girl began to cry, asking for forgiveness from the Duke. And the very next second she was interested, because the Duke asked about his daughter's lover, and Daisy, without realizing it, spoke about her lovers. The man's brow furrowed, looking a little angry. He asked if she had really said lovers and not a lover. When he found out that there were 10 of them, he got up from his seat and stood in front of the window, promising himself that he would not let them get close to his daughter and would kill them all. The girl could not believe her ears. Did he really say that he would destroy everyone? With her hand to her heart, she tried to convince him that all this would be in the distant future. Daisy, determined to prevent a war to save her daughter, asked the Duke to entrust her with the salvation as she is the author and knows the plot and will be able to avoid it. The man turned, smiling and looking at the girl. With her arms outstretched, Daisy convinced the Duke that she would not allow his daughter to get close to all the boys who would ruin her in the future. When he came back, he asked what would happen if it didn't work and assured her that he didn't want Daisy's life, which she had promised if her plan failed. She was interrupted by a maid who informed her that the Duke was late for a meeting. Turning to the girl, the Duke asked her once again if she could really protect Piera. When she agreed, the man held out his hand for her to lean on while he got off his knees, saying that he would allow her to meet his daughter, and that Daisy had only one chance to defend her. The next moment she was already flying towards the ground because the Duke pulled her too sharply, lifting her from her knees. The Duke of Hanston frowned, taking it all as a sign that the author and the heroine should not see each other. Standing at the door of his daughter's room, the Duke turned to the girl, saying that he would introduce her as a nanny, but that this did not mean she would work for him. Putting his hands on her shoulders, the man told her that she would only be a candidate for her nanny, and that she needed to look better than she did now. After straightening her shawl, the Duke opened the door to Piera's room. He said that she should not do anything against the Duchess's will, even if it was for her protection. In front of Daisy stood a little girl with short-cropped hair, smiling sweetly at her future nanny. Looking at the child, she could not believe that this little girl was the main character they had written. The girl looked adoringly at her father, who stroked her hair and told her that she had also cut her braids. Daisy, thinking that the child's hair looked like a cactus or a chestnut shell, almost shouted out, saying that she would like to touch Piera's hair. But all she did was curtsy, greeting Lady Pierrette as she sat in the Duke of Hanston's arms. And while his daughter hugged him, the man smiled slightly, thinking to himself that the candidate would try to get closer to his daughter, as she thought she would. But Daisy came closer, smiling at the child and saying that she was very happy to meet them, asking if she can join their tea party, taking a candy out of her pocket and completely capturing the child's attention. Holding the green-wrapped candy with a frog in it, the girl smiled, knowing that she was describing Pierrette's personality, and that she liked green, sweets, and frogs. When the Duke finally agreed, as his daughter was eager to see the nanny candidate, they were both very happy, raising their hands in a gesture of great joy. They all sat at the table on ordinary chairs, even little Piera, who could barely reach the table. The Duke was not very pleased with the way things had turned out, but he said nothing. Daisy dumped a handful of sweets in front of the girl, which she had taken out of a bowl full of sweets. Piera was delighted to see how many sweets she had. The child was curious about everything, and Daisy told him where the sweets were, while the Duke sat with a disgruntled expression and a pie in his hand. After tasting 3 different marmalades, the girl jumped up because the taste was incredible and immediately turned to her father, making him laugh out loud. Sitting down next to his daughter, the Duke said that dinner was coming up and reminded her to thank him for the sweets and say goodbye to the lovely lady. But Daisy didn't give up. She got her last trump card, which caught the child's eye, a pumpkin-shaped candy, because the girl adored pumpkins, and in the future she would feel comfortable in a pumpkin field. Sitting down to look the child in the eye, the girl said that she also loved pumpkins and wouldn't have dinner if there wasn't at least one dish with this fruit. Reaching out, she wanted to touch the girl's hair, but she was already running to her dad, still holding the candy in her hand, and Daisy felt very embarrassed. Piera was caught by the Duke, who immediately hugged her and smiled, saying that he would find her a nanny she would like. But the girl quickly slipped out of her father's arms, saying that she liked Nanny Daisy, causing a total shock to the Duke. And while the Duke was throwing lightning bolts in her direction, the girl was completely crushed by the lovely Pieta, who called her nanny. Sitting on the floor, she saw that the Duke was very unhappy with what had just happened, because she had ruined all his plans. He even clenched his hands into fists in anger. They returned to the office where the Duke had previously received her. He said that they needed to talk, since the situation had taken such a turn for the worse. Daisy was in 7th heaven because she was going to be his daughter's nanny, who is also the main character, as she almost reminded the man in front of her, but stopped in time. However, the Duke of Hanston quickly set his own condition. She would only pretend to be a nanny, and her main task would be to keep those men away from Pierrette. The Duke stared at Daisy for a few seconds, not taking his eyes off her because she had said that she would not go into details as long as he paid her. This was unexpected. While he was writing down the terms of the contract on paper, he read them out, and the first clause already shocked the girl. She had to live in the palace. The second condition made him smile, as he promised a small reward for saving his daughter from each male character. Daisy opened her mouth in surprise as she looked at the number of her salary she would receive each week, while the Duke enjoyed the effect he had on her. As soon as she signed, the man immediately took the paper off the table, leaving her puzzled. As he folded the document, he smiled, because now his daughter's fate would change, and asked the girl to write down everything she knew about male characters. A notebook immediately appeared in front of her, where she had to write down all the facts she remembered. Duke Hanston was surprised to read all about the boys who were to ruin Pierrette's fate. He could not believe that the son of the commander of the guard and the sorcerer from the tower were there. Daisy tried to explain that she had only written 5 of them, because she couldn't remember the names of the others because they were so complicated. But sitting on her knees in front of the Duke, the girl assured him that she would recognize them by sight if she ever saw them. He had an idea in his head. He wanted to invite everyone to the ball tomorrow so that Daisy could identify everyone and they both knew who to keep away from. The girl didn't know what to say, because the Duke had planned the ball just now and wanted to send out invitations to everyone now that it was after 10 in the evening. The next day, the Duke of Hanston said that everyone had responded, except for one family whose head was temporarily absent, and that there would be 150 guests in total. When Daisy heard about clothes for herself, she began to dream of a beautiful dress, pearls, and elegant outfits. She couldn't wait for the festive ball as she had never been to one and now she had the opportunity. But it was all just a dream. In reality, she now stood in the middle of the hall where everyone was dancing, holding a mountain of dirty dishes and asking herself why she had to be a maid at the ball. Sitting in front of the mirror some time ago, the Duke explained that only servants attend balls, apart from guests, because nannies have nothing to do there. While Daisy was struggling to hold the pile of dishes, she was approached by a nice woman who asked her with a smile and politeness to bring her hairbrush from the first floor. However, as soon as she agreed, the other ladies started asking her to bring something else, shouting at each other. While Daisy played the role of a maid, the Duke sat quietly away on a sofa and drank wine, watching the girl and wondering if she had really decided to become a maid. The girl was very angry because the Duke ignored her, and she had a feeling that she was doing all this for nothing. But she was distracted by a man's voice, which she turned to hear as she hugged a pile of dishes. A handsome, tall man was taking care of his pregnant wife, and Daisy couldn't believe it. Was it them? She recalled how she and her friend were lying in front of their notebooks, discussing the red eyes of one of the main characters, who was a scientist, and this was the feature that made him different. He was an amazing scientist, a genius, born once every few centuries, a young talent who paid attention only to books on science. But one day he met Pieta and forgot about everything in the world, now seeing only her. She remembered these storylines that hadn't happened yet, and here he is in front of her. But she looks at his father, who is just as handsome and has red eyes, and the protagonist hasn't even been born yet. Standing a little further away, Daisy was touched by her husband's attitude towards his wife, his support, attention, and efforts to do everything for her comfort. The next moment, the girl was pushed by one of the newly arrived guests, a tall, handsome man who did not even try to get around the other guests, considering himself superior to everyone else. Stepping on the pregnant woman's dress, his daughter quickly followed her father, almost unable to keep up with his wide stride. Neither of them even looked at those they left behind. They talked about how she had to make the Duke fall in love with her, and his daughter could be given to his servants to raise so that she would not interfere. And they argued about it all the way. Lifting up the pregnant woman's cloak, Daisy stared in the wake of the Marquis and his daughter, not believing her ears. The girl kept thinking about who Pierrette's own mother was, because they hadn't written it down, and there was no point in asking the Duke. He wouldn't tell her anyway. Throwing her cloak over the pregnant woman's shoulders, she decided that her primary task was to take care of the mother of the unborn protagonist, so she asked if she was in good health. Now the Countess was sitting on a chair, holding her stomach with one hand and closing her eyes as she rested, coming to her senses. Daisy lied with a sweet smile, justifying her knowledge of the pregnant woman's name by saying that the Duke had ordered her to take care of her. After a little rest, the couple decided to go to the Duke to greet him and still have fun at the ball. The Count supported his wife by holding her shoulders. The girl was called by one of the guests, who was drunk enough to have it written all over his face. When he said that Daisy could work for him, he put his hand on her buttock, which made her feel uncomfortable, as such harassment was new to her. But in a few seconds he was holding his head, and Daisy was clutching the plate she had used to hit the impudent man over the head with. He was offering her unforgivable things. But the shock had passed, and now she realized that she was in deep trouble for hitting the Duke's guest. As soon as the man recovered from the shock, he got to his feet, shouting at the girl, calling her names. As if on cue, the Duke appeared at the same moment, standing behind her and asking what had happened. The guest began to say that this girl should be fired and sent to the scaffold, showing the lump on his head. But the Duke of Hanston gave her the tray, tapping it with his finger and telling her to choose something heavier if she wanted to beat someone. This completely confused the girl. The man had said too much, provoking the anger of the Duke, who now put him in his place by pointing a finger at his chest and telling him to choose his words before saying anything about his people. Hugging the tray and blushing, Daisy couldn't understand what he was saying, but she watched with rapt attention. The guards dragged the Baron, who was still addressing the Duke, out, while Hanston watched the performance and did not react. Shocked, Daisy covered her mouth with her hand, not believing her ears. The Duke said that this was his last meeting with the Baron, and it was all because of her. Now the Marquis, who had treated the Countess badly before, was speaking to the Duke of Hanston, but now he was smiling and showering compliments as he introduced his daughter Belle. The girl looked at the Duke with reverence, saying that she was looking forward to the meeting. Belle looked incredibly beautiful with her curls and in her blue dress. The Duke sat in his seat with a glass in his hand, thinking about his own, while Belle realized that he was very handsome, and that being the mother of his children was not so bad, although she had thought otherwise before. Her father's eyes nearly fell out of his head in surprise when the girl, smiling sweetly, asked if she could call the Duke by his first name, Dion. Looking at her husband, she waited for an answer while she recalled that she had rejected all marriage proposals just for him, because she wanted to be his wife. The Duke said nothing but an apology as he walked away. He walked past the astonished father and daughter without explaining what was wrong, just clenching his hand into a fist. It was at that moment that he saw the Baron snarling at Daisy, who stood frightened and unable to defend herself against his attacks. And now that the drunken guest had been taken out, Daisy clutched the tray in her hands and said she had something to tell him. She was confused because he knew that she had had a conversation with Countess Rappel, while she only had to confirm his words. Leaving Daisy alone, he left, saying that they would talk in the library in the evening. As she watched him go, she could hear whispers, for many of the guests had heard that phrase. As she continued to help at the ball, she heard gossip about the affair. It wasn't hard because everyone was so busy guessing that they didn't notice the person they were talking about, even though they didn't really believe their own conclusions. As Daisy climbed the stairs, she wondered where Pieta was and why she was not at the ball, as the other children were present. She knocked on the door of her room, letting her know that it was her, so that the child would not be frightened, and then announced that she was coming inside. The child was lying on her bed with her head buried in the pillow and her fists clenched. She was upset that she was not allowed to go to the ball. Sitting down at the bedside, Daisy invited the girl to go somewhere with her, but did not say where she decided to take the little Duchess. They went out onto the terrace of one of the many halls of the palace, the Mirror Hall, and Pierrette was delighted with everything around her, while Daisy carried a tray of goodies. Sitting at the table, the girl kept looking at the mirrored ceiling, saying that it was very beautiful at night, and that she would like to have a ball herself. Daisy, smiling and showing the jug in her hands, asked if she would like some warm milk. While the girl was reaching for her cup, Daisy sat down across from her and asked if it was her dad who had told her not to leave her room. But the child shook her head, saying that this was not true because she did not want to go to the ball herself, and her uncle had nothing to do with it. She said that everyone around her wanted to touch her hair, so she didn't leave, and Daisy echoed her, saying that it looked incredible. Pieta said that you could touch her hair if she allowed it, which caused the nanny to have an overreaction. She even got up from the table. Immediately, the Duchess said that only her uncle could touch her hair now, and she was not allowed to. The girl was puzzled, because this was the second time the girl had called the Duke of Hanston her uncle. She could not believe it, because she was the author of the novel and did not know that Dion was Pierrette's uncle, not her father. After a while, when they returned from the terrace to the room, Daisy was helping the girl to get dressed in her pajamas, preparing the girl for bed. They smiled and talked about pumpkins, because the girl had her pajamas with her, and she thought they were the most delicious thing in the world. Delighted with the evening and with her nanny, the girl quickly closed her eyes, falling asleep almost immediately as Daisy admired her appearance. As she got down on the floor and leaned on the bed, she closed her eyes and exhaled. It had been an extremely difficult day. She remembered asking him why she called the Duke Dad, wondering what Pieta had said because he would be sad if she didn't call him that. As she turned to face the bed and leaned on it, Daisy thought about meeting Hanston, but sleep was stronger than she was. She could hear someone's voice through her slumber, but she had no idea that it was Dion Hanston who had entered her niece's room and was now covering Daisy with a blanket to keep her warm. The next day, Daisy talked about what she had understood at the ball, about the Count's Rappel's son, and about trying to remember everything about the main male characters. Looking at his papers and propping his head up with his hand, the Duke said that the boy had not yet been born and had already caused a lot of problems. Daisy, on the Duke's orders, recalled how Pieta would meet this young man, saying that he would become her tutor because he would be a genius and graduate much earlier than the others. She told a story where the boy's parents did not have the money to send him to study abroad. They were poor, their clothes were all in patches, but they wanted the best for their son. With her arms folded across her chest, she would say that he had given up his studies for Pieta because he had fallen in love, but Daisy didn't like it and was open about it. Opening her eyes, she fell silent, looking frightened at the Duke of Hanston, who now folded his arms in front of him and leaned his elbows on the table, looking furious. Standing up from his chair, the Duke thought aloud that it was possible to send the Rappel's son to study abroad, as long as he did not serve as his daughter's tutor. The girl was delighted with her novel, so she said that the Duke might change his mind if he listened to the story to the end. He looked at her with a frown, cutting off any attempts to continue the story. He said that he didn't care and that he would decide what to do and how. Turning around, he put his hand in his pocket, thinking about his own thoughts and letting Daisy go. Their meeting was over, and yet she came back, not even opening the door but asking if she could ask him something. Dion was looking out the window at the time and answered without even turning around that it was possible. But her question about Pierrette's fake father confused him, and he turned to face her. He was surprised that she knew, because this was not the kind of information that was freely circulating in the palace. Clenching her mouth, she blurted out what Pieta had told her yesterday. She was afraid to face his anger and mentally scolded herself because she couldn't keep her mouth shut. But she heard the paper falling on the table, so she opened her eyes and stared in surprise at the papers the Duke had ordered her to read. Daisy was surprised. The Duke was only a few years older, and she had seen the birth certificate with her own eyes, where the girl was listed as a daughter. Dion came close to the girl, saying that he considered her his daughter and threatened her so that not a single living soul would know about it. The girl promised that she would not tell anyone, and that it did not matter to her whether she was really his daughter, but that he cared for Pieta better than anyone else, and that was the most important thing. Daisy recalled that she was surprised by Pieta's appearance, but thought she was nice and, most importantly, that she was better off with the Duke. Without saying a word, Hanston walked over to a shelf of books, taking out one of them and confusing the girl. Holding the papers in her hands, she couldn't believe her eyes. A huge wardrobe appeared as the wardrobe slid to the side, revealing many flawless dresses. In his thoughts, he said that he chose these things himself and worked very hard to buy them. But Pieta always chooses her own clothes and never wears what he chooses. Daisy was surprised that all the dresses were new, but then she began to defend the girl's choice because she was active and felt very uncomfortable in the dresses. She was glad that the Duke had returned to his normal state and was remembering everything about his daughter, but she was still wondering what to do with the rappels. The girl sat down on the bed in her room in the palace, and closing her eyes exhaled and began to stretch her neck, feeling tired. She lay down on the bed with her clothes on, arms and legs stretched out. Daisy recalled that she had spent the whole day with Pieta, and before that she had listened to everything about the girl from the Duke. He was very fond of her, but the girl woke up to loud noises, not understanding their nature because the ball had already ended. She sat on the bed and yawned, covering her mouth with one hand. Having left the room, Daisy now stood in the corridor, completely at a loss. There would be guests at the palace tonight, and everyone was trying to clean the kitchen and prepare a special dinner on Hanston's orders. When Daisy learned that the Count and Countess Rappel would be the guests, she turned around and, holding her skirt, was about to go to the Duke, when the maid looked at her questioningly. She ran down the corridors, thinking that the Duke should have been warned about this visit, as she had only told him about this family and their unborn child that morning. What was he up to and why had he called them? The girl sat on her bed trying to stay calm, although it was not easy. She had not seen the Duke all evening and could not find him anywhere in the palace. Thinking that he was probably in the main building, she looked back at her maid's uniform hanging on the wardrobe and had a plan. Now she was pushing a trolley with food through the empty corridors of the palace, going straight to the room where the Duke of Hanston was having dinner. Daisy saw the food prepared for the couple and could not understand why the Duke was trying so hard, and what he wanted to achieve with this meeting. The couple were sitting with the Duke, who had just announced his proposal, when Daisy entered the room and stood as if she had heard about the proposal. The Count looked at the Duke in confusion, saying that he did not understand why he had suggested this. Standing with her back to him, the girl tried to eavesdrop, hearing only that the Duke was talking about research and science, because the Count's family had always been drawn to knowledge. Holding her hand on her stomach, the Countess covered her mouth with her palm. She was surprised and touched by the Duke's proposal, as her husband had always dreamed of becoming a scientist. Hanston stood his ground and smiled sweetly. He understood the feelings that the Count's family evoked and appreciated them. The girl finally heard what she was interested in. The Count mentioned the Tistan Empire, where he had offered the Count to go to study at the academy. The couple were surprised and touched at the same time, listening to the Duke and not believing their own ears that he would even help them with transport to get away. Daisy, meanwhile, holding a tray with a cup, opened her mouth in surprise. He had decided to send them to Tistan. When the Rappelus left, the girl tried to catch up with the Duke of Hanston by calling him, as she had many questions for him. Turning to her, Dion explained that he had sent them there because their son would be the main character and pose a threat to Pieta. Moreover, he would want to study abroad anyway. The Duke of Hanston smiled, saying that nothing was impossible for him. He was looking at Daisy because he had beaten at least one of the 10. Trying on a jabot that would match his outfit today, the Duke did not even turn to Daisy, who was shocked. He had informed her before that he had taken all her belongings from the house, and they were to be delivered to the palace. She was in over her head, because she was planning to return there and loved both her home and her restaurant. Still, turning his head to the girl, the Duke looked at her questioningly, explaining that he had done this so that she would not have to pay rent every month, even though he would not live there. But she bawled her eyes out and tried to explain that she would have nowhere to go if he fired her, although she could not explain why. Turning away, he began to adjust the buttons on his shirt, saying that he would not have called her his person, as he had at the ball in front of everyone, if he had intended to throw her out. While continuing to be nice and looking at Daisy again, the Duke mentioned a secret that she knows and can tell others. Blushing and thinking about what he had said, she classified the Duke's habit of calling those he employed his people for life as a bad thing. Daisy bowed to the young man, thanking him for his concern, who informed her that her luggage had not yet arrived, but that he would bring it as soon as it was in the palace. Hardy stood in front of her, smiling as she thought about the fact that he was not in the original story at all. She had to raise her hands, saying that everything was fine, when the guy asked if she was okay, because she was also thinking about the fact that the Duke of Hanston did not appear in their novel. But having received the answer, the butler bowed, putting his hand to his chest in a gesture of respect, and announced that he would leave since everything was fine. Looking at Hardy's trail, she thought that she had to be careful because she didn't know many things, even though she had written a novel, and the guy had a strange glint in his eye. But soon another butler, older and more respectable, brought her luggage, asking her if there were stones in it because for a simple girl, she had too many things. The man threw her suitcase right on the floor, which surprised her. He didn't understand why he should be kind to her, and she was frightened to see her belongings falling to the floor with a loud thud. Straightening his tie, he looked at her calmly, saying that he couldn't wait for her to be released so he could see it with his own eyes. Looking at the butler's disgruntled expression, Daisy couldn't understand why he was angry with her, since he had only brought her luggage. However, when she apologized to him, even though there was nothing to apologize for, a joyful Pieta flew into the room and immediately ran to Daisy, calling her name. But the girl stopped when the man sat down next to her, saying that they hadn't seen each other for a long time and that she should show him her pretty face. The girl looked at him in surprise, greeting him with a short, "Hello," but the very next moment her joy was gone, as Pierrette looked ashamed and embarrassed at the butler, who told her that ladies should not walk the way she had just run. The child ran up to Daisy, hiding behind her and clutching the skirt of her dress because she felt protected by it. Looking at her husband guiltily and clutching Daisy's skirt, Pieta said that Hardy had let her run and said it was okay, but he held his ground, smiling, even though he had shamed the child, because ladies don't behave like that and don't run around, because it's not proper. The girl was shocked and angry because Pieta was a child, and the butler insisted that she had put on those strange trousers again and needed to learn to choose the right things. The girl's eyes were wet while the old man ranted about how she would not get married even at 30, and that a woman's value ends after the age of 21. Daisy was angry because he might have been a good butler, but he had no right to speak to the Duke's daughter in that way. And after he told them that if they didn't obey him, the family's reputation would fall below the plinth, Daisy was completely overwhelmed with anger. With her arms folded across her chest, she ignored Pieta, who was holding onto her dress. She couldn't stand it. She wrote down what the butler was carrying. They began to argue, where the author defended the girl's rights and that it was unacceptable to say such nonsense to a child. Leaning over to Pieta, he asked her if she wanted to be an uneducated woman like her nanny, and she would be if she continued to behave the way she was. Daisy attacked the man with renewed vigor, shouting at him for what he had said to the girl, especially that she was only valuable until she was 21. They kept shouting at each other, trying to find out who was who, because each had his own truth. The butler laughed when he found out that she was a nanny, because she did nothing and could not even attend banquets, which caused Daisy to look at him questioningly. But they both turned at the sound of Pieta's voice, surprised by her request. She asked them to stop quarreling. The butler looked at the girl in puzzlement because only now did it dawn on him that she wasn't lying, and he asked her if she was really a nanny. Daisy didn't fail to return the favor, threatening that if she was fired on his watch, she would drag him down with her. She pointed a finger to be sure. The butler blushed, but listened in silence to what Daisy was telling him, who recommended that he never say anything like that to the child again if he wanted to stay here. And the second condition, which she voiced by pointing her finger at his chest, was that he never call her an uneducated woman again and added a few threats. After finishing the conversation, she pointed to the exit, telling him to get out of her room as soon as possible. Clicking his tongue, he turned around and, shrinking into his tailcoat, walked out under the watchful eyes of Daisy and Pierrette. As she closed the door behind the butler, she thought about how he had been, because he hadn't even thought to apologize. Sitting down next to the girl, she tried to convince her that she wasn't angry, because she thought she was, looking at her with her big, sweet eyes. Holding the child's hand in hers, Daisy explained that she had nothing to apologize for, that it was not her fault that Deacon Peter was so horrible, and that no one had the right to treat her like that. Blushing, the girl almost cried, saying that everyone around her said the same thing as the deacon about her short hair or the clothes she chose. Wiping her tears with her free hand, Pieta said that she asked her father if she was really strange because she had heard such things from guests, and then those guests never came to see them again. To Daisy's complete confusion, the girl said that she would not tell her dad what had happened here because she would not see her again, and she wanted to see Daisy. The author decided to distract the child, so she got his attention by telling him what they would do. She asked him to tell her if such a situation arose again, and not to go to his father. The girl was surprised when the nanny held out her little finger, saying that no one would leave her, including Daisy, if she didn't tell her dad. They swore on their little fingers, and the author promised that she would not go anywhere from her. Pieta was so moved by the moment that she asked if the nanny wanted to touch her hair. She happily explained that it was because they shared a secret and became friends. The girl was happy that the child's good mood had returned, so she could not hold back her sincere smile. Touching her hair, Daisy told Pieta to call her by her first name because they were friends, and that's how friends should talk to each other. The Duke was holding the girl in his arms when she saw the nanny, happy to see her. She thought about how they were getting closer day by day and the child was trusting her more and more. Hanston put the child in the hands of the girl, who was puzzled, saying that he had to work. She understood that raising a child on her own was hard. Pulling the nanny along, Pierrette really wanted to show her something, although she wouldn't tell her what it was. With a twinkle in her eye, the child pointed to a tree in the garden where she had brought her nanny, who did not understand. There was a dried-up tree that was leaning to the side. There were no leaves on it, but there was a sign next to it. While Pieta was happy that they had come here, the girl did not understand why the tree was in such a state. Raising her head and looking at the very top. Looking at the tree with reverence, Pieta said that her mother had planted it, and once said that this place would be special. While the girl was playing nearby, Daisy put her hand on the sick tree and thought about how she now understood why it was being cared for even in this condition. Sitting down on the grass next to the child holding a bouquet of flowers, the nanny asked if this was really the secret place the girl wanted to show her. Putting a flower in her nanny's hair, Pieta smiled and said that Daisy understood her even when she didn't say anything. Saying that her heart was beating very fast, the girl did not want to tell why, turning around and running away from Daisy to her sincere laughter. She was horrified to find Pieta hiding from insects, calling for a nanny. Grabbing the girl, the author ran away from the tree as fast as she could, worried about the child's health. A swarm of bees followed them, stinging Daisy, and she called out to Hardy, the butler, to help them, still keeping up the pace. Next to Pierrette's bed, whose arm was bandaged, stood the Duke, listening to the doctor remove the stinger and say that everything was over. Bowing her head and apologizing to Hanston, she cried because she had to hug the girl tightly so that no bees could get to her. The Duke turned to face her, silently listening to her and noticing something. He asked her to take off the blanket that covered her shoulders, and when Daisy refused, he hovered over her, resting his hand on the wall near her face and repeated his order. Her shoulder was covered with bee stings, her skin was red and there was no living space on her shoulders. But she fell on top of the Duke, clinging to his shirt while he turned his head to the door and ordered Hardy to call a doctor. She woke up in her room after dark to find the Duke standing at the door. She tried to get up, but he clucked his tongue and said there was no need. Sitting down next to her on the bed with a tray of medicines, he apologized and began to apply the bite marks as the doctor had instructed, touching her delicate skin on her shoulder with his thin fingers. When she closed her eyes after he apologized because she had suffered because of Pieta, she thought that it was she who should be fired because she hadn't looked after Pieta. Standing by the bedside, the Duke looked at the girl and recalled what the doctor had said when he removed the stingers from her shoulder. It could have ended badly, and he did not understand how she could have even run to the palace. Covering her with a blanket, Hanston told her not to worry. They would call a doctor and take care of her until she recovered. As he walked out the door, he knew what he had to do. Turning to Hardy, the Duke of Hanston ordered the gardeners to be called. After recovering, they stood in the garden, the Duke and Daisy slightly behind, as Pierrette sobbed over her tree which she loved so much. Picking his daughter up from the grass, the Duke tried to explain that the tree was dangerous and that it had to be removed because she had been hurt. But the child objected. Daisy just listened in amazement to what Hanston said about her when he addressed his daughter. He asked if she had seen the shoulders of the nanny, who had been badly injured by bees living in the tree. She left her father and ran to Daisy to hug her and apologize. Sitting down, she began to stroke the girl's hair, saying that everything was fine and that it was not her fault. Pieta hugged her nanny's neck as she gently held her, trying to convince her that it wasn't her fault and that she was okay. They were both surprised when the Duke said that everything was enough and that it was time to go to breakfast. With eyes full of tears, the girl walked away, saying she hated her uncle. She was followed by a surprised Daisy and a devastated Hanston. Daisy was carrying a tray of food to put by Pieta's bed, who was under the covers and wouldn't come out. But all the goodies faded into the background when she heard what the child had said. The tree was important to her. Now the author did not smile and just stood guiltily next to the bed. She felt a lot of emotions when she heard that the girl now had only her. It was embarrassing for her. Hugging the girl who said they should run away and live together, the author thought only that everything had gone completely wrong. Dion Hanston folded his hands into a lock, calling for a nanny and saying that his child kept calling him uncle. He bowed his head, closed his eyes and exhaled. He had no idea that the girl knew about the tree. The Duke said that her resentment would last a long time. He was once again ignored by Pieta, failing once again when he tried to offer her something and she turned to Daisy. One day, unable to bear it, the Duke took the child and, sitting her on his lap, asked her to forgive him for cutting down a tree that was very important to her. Hanston continued to speak, saying that he loved that tree just as much, but that she and the nanny were much more important to him, and he didn't want them to get hurt again. Hugging Pieta, who was in tears, He suggested that she buy a new tree and plant it together so that they could have their own memories. But he was devastated and disappointed again. Pierrette refused him, saying that he did not understand anything and that the tree would never replace the one that had been cut down. While she hugged the girl, Daisy was upset to see the expression on the Duke's face, who almost burst into tears after his daughter's words. After Pieta fell asleep, Daisy stood in the Duke's office and asked him to listen to her because she had some ideas about what was going on. Recalling what she and the kids were going through, Daisy confidently said that the girl needed a place or a person to switch gears and calm her soul. Hanston listened attentively, turning his face to the girl who offered to introduce Pieta to a girl of her own age who lived not far from the palace. She recalled the shiny hair the color of wheat and sunshine of the grown-up girl she was talking about now, a minor character in the novel. Convincing the Duke, the author was sure that the conversation would be beneficial, especially since she was a girl, and Pieta would soon not remember the tree. She began to tell me that in the novel, they could not become friends because there was a guy who loved Pierrette so much that he isolated her from everyone. Looking at the nanny, the Duke thought she was serious, because she said they would kill two birds with one stone and there would be no more problems with the male character in the future. But aristocratic children don't run around with friends. He asked what would happen if they didn't become friends, because his daughter would be left with a broken heart at such a young age. Daisy was adamant that they would get along, because the girl was quiet and shy and would be interested in someone as energetic as Pieta. Excited about the new story for the girl, she told us her name, Rhodison, who was the second daughter of the Marquis of France. Hardy, holding the envelope in his hand, was surprised but smiled. He said he thought the Duke would never invite strange children to Pieta's birthday party. And while Daisy was smiling and happy about this decision, the Duke was serious and interrupted the boy, who was ranting about how glad he was that the Duke had changed his mind and that my lady would be spending time with other children. Approaching her father and nanny, Pieta asked the latter where Hardy had gone. Thinking that she might disappoint the girl if the guest did not show up, she sat down in front of the girl and told her that the butler was away on business and would be back soon. She continued to ignore her father, saying that even if Hardy was late, it didn't matter, because the most important thing was that Daisy was with her on her birthday. Hanston, devastated by the girl's ignorance, called out to her, holding out his hands and offering to pick her up, but she just turned her back on him, burying her face in her nanny's legs again. Sitting in Hanston's office in the evening, Daisy shared her impression that the girl's disappointment with him was growing, but she began to talk about the pumpkin palace they had talked about when they were walking in the garden. But he didn't listen to her, absorbed in his own thoughts. He wondered aloud if he had really been right to ask the girl to call him dad. And the author now recalled that she herself had a bad influence on his relationship with his daughter, because he followed Pieta, who followed the nanny, seeking her attention. Now she had to memorize everything the girl said, write it down and tell it to the Duke, and she was sure she would die before they could make up. Daisy finally got the Duke's attention by standing next to him, leaning in a little and recounting what she had learned while working in the kindergarten. They were sitting at the table next to each other when Pierrette ran into the dining room, immediately heading for the nanny. Standing next to her, she asked with curiosity and a twinkle in her eye how Daisy had slept, not even paying attention to her father. Turning to the girl, she replied that she had slept well, while recalling the whole plan from yesterday. One of the children's mothers once told me that if a child is upset with his father, he should hold his father's hand, so that he will also want to hold his father's hand, and in a few days everything will be back to normal. The Duke sat up straight when the girl turned to him, asking if Pieta wanted to say hello to her father and taking his hand. It was clear that Hanston, with his mouth covered by his free hand, clenched into a fist, was blushing in embarrassment at the nanny's holding his hand. He turned his head to the side in embarrassment, and Daisy, blushing, mentally screamed at him, because they had agreed not to be embarrassed. But the girl watched with interest. Turning to the girl, Daisy asked her if she wanted to say hello to her dad, and she said good morning. But a second later, they both stared in puzzlement at Pieta, who simply left the table without saying anything. She told me that I shouldn't give up and that the girl just needed to adapt, clenching her fist to gain confidence in her words. But Daisy was worried about something else. The Duke was still holding her hand, not even trying to let go. The girl looked at the nanny, asking why she couldn't stay as she was going on business. To the surprise of the Duke and Daisy, Pierrette took her purse and ran away with it, clutching it to her because she thought that the nanny would not leave. Hanston turned to his daughter, saying that it was very rude to take other people's things. Standing in the hall, she realized that everything had gone wrong again, because the Marquise's family had received an answer, and they had to get out of the castle before Pieta saw them. Although she handed over the bag, the child folded her arms across her chest and turned and said she hated her uncle. Daisy sat down next to her, putting her hand on the girl's hair and smiling, saying that she would be back soon. Hearing the words that the nanny never lies to her, the Duke closed his eyes and exhaled. He was once again broken by his daughter's behavior. They were sitting at the Marquis's house. The Duke was drinking tea, while Daisy listened to the Marquis with a smile and reverence, holding a plate of cake in her hand. The couple bowed to the Duke, justifying their absence from a ball he had organized not long ago. They explained why they could not attend. And while the Duke said that the reason for the visit was to ask whether their daughter would come to his child's birthday party, Daisy was already holding an envelope in her hands, showing it to the couple. Snatching the envelope from the girl's hands, the Marquis and his wife looked at the invitation in awe, and the Marquis even put her hand to her mouth in amazement. The Duke of Hanston listened calmly to the couple's assurances that they would be, glancing at them and at Daisy, who was sitting a little closer to the couple. He called the children who were now standing before the Duke, the eldest son named Pat and the youngest named Rentley. The Marquise began to shed a tear, saying that time flies very quickly when she watches her children grow up. They were both shocked because they thought they were having a girl, but now they only saw 2 sons. Once again, things were not going according to plan. The Duke turned to the Marquis, saying that he had come to see their daughter because he did not want to make a lot of noise, as it was the first time he was inviting someone to his daughter's birthday. When she was brought in, Rhodison timidly clung to her nanny's dress, greeting the guests and looking at them with wide eyes. The Duke smiled when he saw the girl, and Daisy was delighted with little Rhodison's appearance, which was incredibly cute. Daisy was smiling with Dion when he invited the girl and his daughter's birthday party, and assured her that it would be fun, even though she would be the only guest. The girl could not believe that she could go somewhere without her brothers, so she asked again to make sure. The author said that this was true and she was sure that the girls would get along, and that they had prepared a lot of goodies to honor the holiday. The girl caught Daisy's little finger with her pinky, who promised that they would have fun and said that she would love to go to the holiday. When they returned, Pieta was immediately in the girl's arms, hugging her, happy to see her back. The nanny asked her with a smile if Pieta had been well behaved. The Duke stood behind, completely surprised, as his daughter kissed her nanny on the cheek, saying that she had fulfilled her promise. Daisy puts the girl on the floor, telling her to go kiss her dad, but she makes a bow on her lips, saying that now Dad has Daisy to kiss him. They were both confused by what the kid said, not understanding what she was talking about. They looked at each other in embarrassment, but decided to play the play to the end so that Pieta would finally stop being angry with her father. They were both too close to each other, blushing and embarrassed by the minimal distance between them and the fact that they had to kiss each other. Dining with his nanny and daughter, the Duke couldn't help but be overjoyed. Pieta kept asking who they had invited to her birthday party, because it would be the first time she would be hosting guests. Daisy couldn't help but rejoice, folding her hands in front of her, saying that my lady would soon have a friend. They both admired the expression on the girl's face, who still couldn't believe that this was her first holiday that she would be celebrating with a friend and not her father. But the fun quickly passed. She asked how they would have fun, as they were seeing each other for the first time. Daisy said she was sure that the 2 girls would get on well together and have plenty to do and talk about. Moreover, her dad had taken care of the invitation so that they would both have memories of the day. The kids even stood up from their chairs and leaned on the table when they heard about the new furniture their dad had ordered and the cake baked by a famous pastry chef. The girl wanted to see the cake and decorate the hall with pumpkins, but she came to her senses and again behaved coldly towards her father, trying to hide her joy behind her resentment. Hardy leaned over to the Duke, who was smiling and happy, bringing him back to reality and reminding him with a single word of business that could not wait. Turning to Daisy, he told her that he was counting on her, but he stopped immediately when he felt his daughter hugging his leg and turned to face her and the nanny. Hiding behind the nanny's skirt, Pieta said it wasn't her, and that she had just confused her dad with Daisy. The girl called for her nanny and waited for her to sit down in front of her, then immediately hugged her to Daisy's complete surprise and asked her to pass the hug on to her father. The Duke and the butler looked at this scene in confusion, not understanding what was happening. The child was cunning, saying that she would not have the courage to hug her father herself, and asked her nanny to help her out. Blushing, Daisy didn't know how to do it, so she began to say, stammering, that her daughter had told him to be careful. But the very next moment she found herself in the Duke's arms, not understanding what was happening and blushing even more. Both embarrassed, they opened their arms when the Duke said it was okay to refuse to do something she didn't like. Still flustered, the author began to defend herself, saying that she had never said she didn't like it. The shocked Duke stood in front of her as Pieta turned away, looking smug as her plan to bring them together worked. As Pieta climbed the steps to the bed, Daisy reproached herself for what she had said to the Duke, now wondering why she had said it and that her tongue was always her enemy. Turning her gaze to the child, the author asked if Pieta could make her father feel better. She looked at him with her big sweet eyes and asked if he was very upset, clutching the blanket and hiding half of his face in it. The girl jumped up on the bed, excited to go to her dad's room and wish him sweet dreams, much to Daisy's surprise. The girl was pleased, because now Pieta was no longer resentful of the Duke and she had finally moved on with her plan to reconcile them. The little girl flew through the door opened by the nanny, attracting her dad's attention and calling him happily. Hanston stood up, leaning on the table and not believing his eyes. It was really his daughter. Pierrette, sitting in her father's arms, apologized to him, because she had never meant to hurt him. Hugging the girl and holding her close, The Duke also apologized because he should not have cut down the tree that was so important to her. And then Pieta joyfully announced that she wanted the three of them to sleep together tonight as a sign of reconciliation. The eyes of both of them nearly popped out of their sockets when they heard what the little girl was proposing. Hugging the toy pumpkin, the girl was happy to lie on the edge of the bed and feel Daisy's arms around her. She remembered the child's face when she asked her father, also shedding a tear, and realized that they both became weak when they saw her crying. Daisy was angry, speechless when Pieta called out to her father, telling him to turn to face them even though his back was to them. Tian lay looking at the wall and felt himself blushing when he heard Daisy say that everything was fine. Daisy could feel the Duke's face turn, causing her eyes to widen, but she could not see him looking at his daughter, his hand propping his head up. The girl quickly fell asleep in her nanny's arms while she was lying there, afraid to move. The Duke was awake when she called him, apologizing for her distress over his child's whims. But smiling, the nanny replied that everything was fine, as if it was not clear that she was embarrassed. She asked who the girl's mother was, but he immediately told her not to answer if it was important to him to talk about it. The Duke placed one finger of his hand on the girl's arm, a gesture of reassurance. He looked at the back of her head with a completely different look than the first time they met. He told her that she had nothing to worry about, and that it was normal to be interested in such things. It turned out that her mother was his own sister. He recalled how he and his sister had lost their parents and how each relative had their own goals, and they all called them to come to them. The Duke recalled that his sister became the head of the family in her 20s, and they had a 7-year difference. He was younger. But this did not stop him from protesting against his sister taking over his father's duties. He told me that he was a rebel, although he would not have been close to Pieta. Upset, he said that there were so many things for which, unfortunately, he would not be able to repay his sister, who had done everything for him. The Duke was sure that his whole life would not be enough to repay him. Stroking the girl's sweet cheeks, Hanston said that she was his sister's last request. He recalled how he once handed his daughter over to Daisy, saying that before he met her he thought they would have a happy life together, but Daisy had changed that, and he thanked her for doing so much more. After the Duke's confession, she wanted to leave, saying that my lady had already fallen asleep, but he only hugged her tighter, saying that his daughter might wake up. Daisy put her fist to her mouth, embarrassed. She wondered what the Duke's expression would be if she turned to face him right now. After all, he could hear her heartbeat as he leaned his chest against her back. He had said he knew what it was when she had tried to explain. Blushing completely, Daisy began to explain what was going on and why her heart was pounding. But they both stared at each other when they heard the sound of the gases and stopped talking. The girl insisted that it was not her, but my lady. The next evening, they were both shattered and almost falling asleep, sitting in the Duke's study, when Hardy asked if they were both in pain. The Duke looked at the butler, who said something about the same symptoms with distrust, asking what it meant. Hardy said that it was very similar to child fatigue syndrome, to which the Duke replied that anything was possible. Hanston looked at the liquor shelf with a questioning look in his eyes. He didn't remember the bottle that was there among the others. Taking the bottle and glasses, Hardy said that it was a gift from Baron Solfino, and that everyone needed to relax a little and spend time with adults. While Daisy was surprised, the Duke folded his arms across his chest and looked bored at the boy. Too predictable. The three of them slowly drank alcohol, which drew out of Daisy the fact that it is very important to find an approach to my lady. But Pieta, who had flown into the room, immediately said that she wanted to sleep with the three of them like last night. Daisy choked on her alcohol, spitting it out in surprise. Wiping her mouth with her sleeve, Daisy said that she couldn't, as she would immediately get covered in paint. Sipping his cup, the Duke assured me that he could not, because he did not plan to go to bed, as he still had a lot of work to do. Folding her arms across her chest, the little girl told her father that he needed to sleep, because people need more sleep as they get older. He grabbed his daughter, hugging her tightly to the soft laughter of Hardy and Daisy, when the girl protested that her father smelled of alcohol and his stubble was itchy. The little girl quickly climbed into the arms of her nanny, saying that they were adults and needed to control the amount they drank. The Duke became more serious, saying that he thought his daughter Daisy liked it much more than he did. And while the girl thought that this was true because she had mastered the nanny's magic, Pieta told her father that he needed to like Daisy too. And then the little girl said that she would not sleep either and, looking at the author with her sweet eyes, invited her to play. When everyone agreed to play, the little girl ran off to get the thread and cards, leaving the nanny puzzled because she didn't understand why she needed the cards and thread. Sitting with a box of cards, the girl explained that the one who wins gets a punishment card. She held up a card with a teddy bear with a heart on its cheek, and Daisy wondered what it could mean. But Pieta quickly kissed her nanny on the cheek, surprising her with what the card meant. When the nanny understood the rules, everyone was ready to play, and she was determined to win. Daisy was angry because she couldn't play at all, and the others laughed at her, which made her even angrier. She was so angry. Trying to justify herself, the girl said that she was playing for the first time, but for the Duke, the game clearly did not look as simple as he wanted to make it seem. With his arms crossed over his chest, Hanston said that he had never tried to play either, but he would definitely be much better at it. They were gambling and drunk, so they argued with each other, not noticing that Pieta yawned over and over again. Both the Duke and Daisy heard that Hardy had gone to put the baby to bed, so they didn't get distracted, playing until the Duke chose the orange card for the nanny. She looked at the card she had pulled out, not believing her eyes and blushing not only from the alcohol, but also from what she had to do. Now they were both excited because now the Duke knew which card he was going to draw, a bear with a heart and lips. Daisy jumped up from the couch, saying that she had had enough for today, and the Duke, without looking at her, agreed, still holding the card in his hand. Immediately she became dizzy and fell on top of the Duke, resting her hand on his chest while he held the girl with both hands and looked into her eyes. She began to apologize, saying that she would quickly remove all the broken glass. Propping his head up with his hand, the Duke smiled smugly, asking if she was going to run away without accepting the punishment for losing. And then it hit her. She realized that Kashtanchik, as she called Pieta to herself, was a provocateur. It was reflected in her face. But she had always kept her word, so taking the Duke's face in her hands, she was going to fulfill what she had lost. The next morning, the Duke watched Daisy play with Pieta, drawing something and paying no attention to him. At breakfast, Hardy asked when they went to bed, and the Duke asked out loud, albeit to himself, because he did not remember. After that, the girl rushed out of the dining room, saying that she was already full and had to run errands. Sitting on the table, the Duke folded his hands in front of him and thought that Daisy was avoiding him, but he desperately needed to talk to her about the letter he had received from their doctor. Hanston exhaled noisily, folding his arms across his chest and remembering that the doctor had made a perfume to repel bees. But he still had to examine the girls, and he had to give an answer that day. The Duke put his hands in his pockets and, standing in his study, thought that he had to take care of everyone Pieta liked, including Daisy, whom he could not catch for a conversation. The girl turned her head to the side in embarrassment, not wanting to meet the Duke's eyes when he stood in front of them, attracting the attention of both. He saw that expression again, looking at the nanny and wondering if she was really so disgusted with him that she wouldn't even look at him. And again she ran away somewhere, not wanting to talk and pretending that she had a lot to do. Hanston was angry and very determined to catch Daisy for a conversation, because there was no time to waste. He entered the wine cellar after the girl, which surprised her. She didn't think the Duke would follow. He asked, smiling, though a little forcedly, if she was busy. She tried to run away again, saying she had business with Hardy, but the Duke stuck his hand in the wine barrel behind her, blocking her path. Looking down at her, the Duke said that the butler would be going on business, as he had sent him to solve several issues. He said that they needed to talk right now and prevent such situations in the future, talking about bees and still hovering over the girl when she spat out that it would never happen again. Frowning, he still didn't understand how she could swear on her name that she would no longer be stung by bees. Wrapping herself in a blanket and embarrassed, she blurted out that yesterday was a mistake and she had simply gotten very drunk, not even listening to what the Duke was saying about perfume. But when Hanston finally began to understand what she was talking about, the girl was already running for the exit, remembering the kiss and confusing the Duke, who was looking after her. He remembered how last night she had accepted her punishment for losing and kissed him, because she always kept her promises. The Duke called the girl, asking her to wait and saying that he was talking to her about bees, not about yesterday. Daisy, Pieta, Hanston, and Hardy were traveling in a carriage, and two of them were feeling rather awkward. The Duke was looking out the window, not paying attention to what was happening inside the carriage, and Daisy was only thinking that she couldn't breathe when she looked at him. But the nanny was quickly distracted by Pieta, who was very excited because it was her first time going somewhere with Daisy. Once inside the store, Daisy opened her mouth in amazement because it was huge and had almost everything in the world. Now they both watched as the kids dragged Hardy to pick out decorations for the upcoming birthday party, leaving them alone. The Duke and the girl were confused and unhappy, and Hardy, meanwhile, told the girl that he did not think she would need his company because she almost never paid attention to him. Blushing a little when they were alone, the Duke glanced over at Daisy, who was standing a step ahead of him. The girl was handed the box when the Duke said he had something for her. The man said that he had managed to repair everything. Opening the box, the author looked at her pendant, which had been broken by the Duke earlier, and could not believe her eyes. It was intact. Hanston said with a smile that there was no need to thank him, because he had no right to break something that belonged to her, and he apologized to her for that. The girl was embarrassed as she held the box, but now because she herself had to apologize to the Duke, because she had run away from him and it was very childish. A gray-haired man with a beard appeared on the threshold and interrupted her, saying joyfully and loudly that he had seen a familiar carriage, recognizing the Duke of Hanston himself. When the shop assistant tried to escort the guest out, the Duke said that there was no need to stop her, because he knew the person standing in front of him. He and the Count shook hands, smiling broadly and talking about their own business, because they had known each other for many years. When she heard the name Santorini, the author looked closely at the scene unfolding before her eyes, and now recalled how this name appeared in the novel in the first place. The friend invented a handsome and dangerous thief and guild leader with incredible charisma and a love of blue alcohol. Grabbing the Duke's hand, she dragged him into the closet because she had to tell him what she had just remembered. She didn't even ask him, confusing him with where she was taking him. The author was floating in her thoughts, mixed with the scent of the Duke's perfume, thinking that she had no idea how she would know what kind of perfume he was wearing. A little puzzled, the Duke asked what had happened and whether the girl was going to play hide and seek with him again as she had before. But the next moment, he looked at the girl in surprise, not believing his ears and asking her if she was sure that the grandson of Count Santorini was the main male character. And now it was her turn to be surprised, because the Duke said that the Count had never had a wife and had no heirs, and that he had won his title in battle. Hanston shook his head, rejecting the bastard option because the Count was an honest man and always took responsibility for his own actions and for the person with whom he was in a relationship. Daisy put her hand to her face and thought about it, because she remembered it clearly, but she said she could have been mistaken. But the Duke thought about it, putting his hand to his face in the manner of a girl and saying that they needed to know for sure, so they had to check everything they could and had on the Count. A few seconds later, the door of the storeroom opened and a surprised saleswoman and a butler stood on the threshold, asking what they were doing in the storeroom together. Sitting by Pietta's bedside, who was sleeping sweetly, the author reproached herself for getting into a double situation again, and again with the Duke, when they were caught in the closet. She decided to clean up all the toys the girl had left in the room before she went to bed, so that there would be no mess. There were cards with bears on them, like the ones they used to play the kissing game with, but there were no pictures on them. Sitting in the middle of the room, she realized that the cards were strange, but she couldn't find out what was bothering her. Daisy finally realized what was wrong and that it was yesterday's box of cards, but there were no hearts drawn. Recalling the meeting with the co-authors, she also recalled that they had made Pierretta a gray cardinal and now sat there, unable to believe that it was the kid who had drawn and erased the heart. The next day, she brought a drink she had made herself and asked Daisy to try it and tell her if Rhodison would like it. Clutching the saucer in her hand, the nanny tipped the cup, thinking that she should praise the girl, even if the drink was tasteless. The Duke, who heard the well-deserved praise, smiled and said that he should also like Rhodison, because Pietta had done her best to make this drink. The nanny looked at the girl with a sweet smile, thinking that she had been trying really hard because she was looking forward to Rhodison's arrival. The girl refused another glass of juice, saying that she should only drink one according to research, so she offered the Duke and the nanny to finish it for her. When he heard that his daughter was going to clean her room, Hanston asked if she had really started to grow up and started talking about his nostalgia for her as a child. But Daisy did not share this mood. It was all strange and she wondered what exactly she was doing and what her purpose was. She thought about the girl and the juice she had refused in a complex sentence, but before that she had been like a child, composing only simple and short sentences. And while the Duke was praising his daughter, Daisy realized another important thing. It was the two of them who were the objects of Pietta's attention. And then she realized something else. Her daughter was making her a stepmother, trying to bring her closer to her father. When the girl left the dining room, Daisy banged her fists on the table, attracting the attention of the Duke, who asked what had happened. Catching the kid, Hardy entered the room and informed Hanston that the accountant wanted to see him about last year's taxes. No longer kicking, the little girl hung on the butler's arm, thinking that Hardy was only making things more difficult, since her father was now away on business. Now they were in the wardrobe, where Pietta had put them because she had decided to play hide and seek. The Duke was apologizing, and Daisy, as usual, said everything was fine and smiled. Hanston decided not to waste time and talk about their secret when they were alone, telling them that there was no one in the guilds with the name Santorini. She was surprised and a little confused because the Count had no illegitimate son, but what the Duke said afterwards made her turn her head to him. He smiled smugly, propping his head up with his hand because he said he had found out about the Count's secret meeting and the time and place where it would take place, and now they were arguing, because Daisy asked where the meeting would be but the Duke was not going to share this information. The girl did not give up, saying that she could recognize someone because she knew other names, but Hanston leaned into the wall of the closet, looking her straight in the eye and telling her that he knew how dangerous it could be and that she shouldn't get carried away with such things. They would have continued arguing if not for a voice that made them look at the closet door, from behind which the question of where they could have hidden was heard. It was Hardy, laughing as he tried to find the Duke and the girl's nanny, who was now running after him and trying to lure him away from the closet with all the lies. But when this did not work and he almost opened the wardrobe door, Pietta kicked him in the leg and the butler lost his balance, falling to the floor. Daisy and Dion were shocked to see this scene because they could see everything through the gap Hardy had made when he opened the door. With her arms folded and crying, the girl whimpered, saying that she was wrong to address her father. The Duke was serious as he looked at his daughter and said she needed to go and apologize to Hardy. The author held on, clenching her fist and recalling the words of the Duke, who said that she could not condone everything the child did. She felt sorry for the child, even though it was her fault. As Daisy closed the windows in her room, she thought she would go to bed early after taking a bath and relaxing a little. Hardy and Pieta were sitting on the steps, talking about something, looking at the garden in front of the palace. The girl allowed the butler to touch her hair, which he did, causing her to smile broadly. Daisy couldn't believe her eyes as Hardy managed to get close to the baby in just half a day. She was glued to the window, watching. A few hours ago, the little girl stood in front of the butler, whimpering and apologizing for hitting him, but he just smiled at her. He sat down next to me, smiling broadly and saying that everything was fine and he was not hurt, while Pieta cried, covering her face with her sleeve. But the question of why she always tries to leave the Duke and the nanny alone made her stop crying and look up at Hardy. She started to say that she liked Daisy and that no one loved her like her, because Hardy asked if she was tired of spending time with her nanny. But Hardy, propping his arm up with his hand, said that he also really liked Daisy, smiling a little dreamily. With tears in her eyes, Pieta began to say that Daisy and Dad should get married, not even considering the option of having a nanny with Hardy. But he reassured her, blushing a little and holding up 2 fingers side by side, as he convinced her that he was on my lady's side and that he also wanted this wedding. After praising the girl for doing a lot to bring the two closer together, she sat down on the step and began to tell him that she had done everything she could to ensure that they spent as much time together as possible. The little girl, clenching her fist, said it was hard for her because Daisy was always going somewhere. Sitting down next to her, Hardy surprised her by saying that this was possible because she was using the wrong methods. Copying the old butler, Hardy raised his finger and began to say in a scholarly tone that it was important to develop the relationship between a man and a woman. He said that it was important that they liked each other, but now neither he nor Pieta knows whether the Duke likes Daisy and vice versa. With her hands in her lap, the girl didn't understand how Daisy could not like her, as she had liked her from the first moment she met her. The boy blushed and said that it was true, thinking about his own sympathy for the nanny. The girl was upset because Hardy was right, and even if her father likes the nanny, they don't know if she likes the Duke. The butler was surprised when my lady asked if he could help her. She asked him to help her and make Daisy like her dad, because she and her dad were both adults and he could do something about it. But he finally came up with something. While my mother was throwing a tantrum that he was useless, he told me what they would do. The butler said that they had to keep their conversation secret and act very carefully so that no one would suspect anything. Pieta and Hardy organized the union, rejoicing in it and calling it the Duke's marriage project. Mala was very happy to have a friend, as he called himself. The girl jumped to her feet, rejoicing and saying that now they had to make vows to each other as a sign of their friendship and union. The butler was shocked to see her bend down to touch her hair, saying that she had never allowed him to do so before. He was very touched, smiling and blushing when he heard that they were now friends and it was okay. They both laughed as the boy stroked the girl's hair and said he hoped she would help them in their business. The next day when Daisy came into the room with the gift, she was frightened because the baby immediately jumped out at her with joyful screams. Smiling, the little girl began to say that this was the day her friend would come. So apparently she was already awake, although that was exactly what she had hoped for when she had sneaked into the room. Pieta said that her dad had also come by, but he couldn't sleep. What a silly fool, and she slept very well. With a smile, the nanny said that was not the way to talk about Dad. The girl looked with interest at the box Daisy brought, because her nanny had brought her a present. The little girl was delighted with the gift, smiling, happy, and waving her arms with pleasure when she opened the box. She looked at the pumpkin cake, which was also in the shape of a pumpkin with huge, joyful eyes, which her nanny had given her. Everyone in the palace congratulated the girl, wished her all the best, and smiled. But the whole atmosphere came to naught when the Marquises of France appeared on the doorstep, bursting into tears of gratitude for the invitation to the party. The Duke and Daisy stood in the courtyard with stony faces, because this was not what they had expected, and they could not understand what was happening. Pieta stood there in disbelief, holding on to her father's trousers and watching what these people were saying. At first the Marquis asked who the boy was, but then he and his wife began to shower the girl with compliments as soon as they learned that she was the Duke's daughter. Although her mother called her and told her to say hello, Rhodison stood behind her puffy skirt, awkwardly greeting everyone, but she was not visible. Taking Pieta, who was crying, Daisy looked at the Marquises with displeasure, because for some reason they thought that their daughter's invitation included their arrival. But the Duke, looking at the invitation given by the Marquis, clearly said that it contained only their daughter's name, when the two said that they had decided to invite themselves because it was inconvenient to wait in the carriage all the time. Pieta and Daisy watched Hanston, who said that it was impolite to barge into someone's party uninvited. Standing smiling by their carriage, Dayon pointed to it and said they could go home. After her parents left, Rhodison smiled and became noticeably calmer, sitting down in a curtsy and thanking them for inviting her. Everyone looked at Pierrette in surprise, as she greeted them very awkwardly, and Daisy even asked when she had become so shy. Nanny Rhodison reminded her of the gift she had prepared, and the girl immediately remembered it. Pieta was holding a green box because it was her favorite color, as Deji Rodasan had told her earlier. Then the nanny sat down and said that she wanted to thank her. When the awkward thanks were said, the Duke took both girls in his arms, surprising them, and went inside with them with a smile. Rodasan opened her mouth in surprise and amazement, saying that the palace was very large. And Pieta, holding the gift, was pleased with herself and her home, though she said it was not bad. As Daisy looked into the Duke's wake with the children in her arms, she suddenly remembered with a smile what these girls would be like when they grew up. She remembered that they were supposed to grow up cold towards each other, but now they were having a nice conversation and laughing, so now that part of the story has definitely changed. She and the Duke were peeping through the peephole, worried about how the party was going and whether the girls were doing well. Pieta brought a large jug with difficulty, placing it on the table. She was trying very hard to make her guests feel comfortable. Daisy remembered how her mother had told them not to interfere, because she wanted to make the juice they would be drinking throughout the party by herself and without any help. They tried to hear what the girls were talking about, but the Duke couldn't hear them either, saying that they were too far away. When they saw Pieta walking towards the door behind which they were standing, they both ran to the closet to hide in it. Mala opened the door to the room, knowing full well that Dad and Daisy had been there a while ago and she didn't like it. Sitting in the closet, the Duke told the news that Countess Lapel had given birth to a boy with red eyes like her parents. This news comforted the author, who was delighted, saying that now the Count would study even harder. Embarrassed, Daisy nevertheless admitted that she was frightened when she learned that the Duke had invited them to his house. He looked at the girl, asking her why she was so worried and whether she thought he might do something bad. With a smile, he put a finger to his face, saying that he thought they were already working well together, so she wouldn't have such thoughts. While she was wetting herself in embarrassment, the Duke said that he hadn't thought about what she would be going through and promised that he would tell her everything next time. He decided to tell her about the guild meeting, and Daisy screamed when she found out it was tomorrow. It was a surprise to her. Looking at the girl, the Duke smiled, even though he said that the meeting was so quick, even though the situation was not the most pleasant. To the girl's complete surprise, the Duke reached out and fixed her hair, saying that he was worried about her when he saw her excitement. Hanston looked at her intently, saying nothing, and she wondered if the Duke was her. But she didn't finish her thought, because the little girl opened the wardrobe with a loud cry of Daisy, forcing her to push the Duke away as quickly as possible. Hanston heard the girl scream, turning his attention to her and ignoring Pieta's accusations for the moment. He was interested in finding out if she was okay. But the little girl was the only one who did not feel sorry for the nanny. She folded her arms across her chest and said that she needed it, because she had disobeyed and eavesdropped. The nanny, with her head full of hair, and the puzzled father watched as Pierrette led Rotisen to the mirrored hall, which had been specially decorated for the party. Everyone who worked in the palace dressed up for the occasion and now stood in front of the door to greet my lady on her birthday. The author waited impatiently for the girl to open the door, because even though she helped decorate the hall, she still hadn't seen its final look. Daisy and Rotisen both opened their mouths in surprise, because everything was decorated with pumpkins, which the girl adored so much. She had a lot of them. With her hands at her sides, Pieta, pleased with herself, said that she had been planning all this for a long time. However, the author was distracted from the decor when she noticed something that surprised her. She did not understand how this was possible. The Duke was standing with a smile and one hand in his pocket, and behind him was something huge and covered with a white cloth. A few moments later, the girl was looking at the fountain, which was braided by pumpkin vines and small pumpkins made of pure gold. Wasting no time, the girls began to drink from the fountain, but Pieta was the first to go. Daisy tried to pull the girls by their collars, saying that they would get a lot of sores in their mouths if they continued to drink from there. The little girl scooped water from the fountain with her hands, asking her nanny to try it herself. She was curious, wondering if it was really more than just water. As soon as she tasted it, the author was delighted with the taste because it was refreshing and sweet, and it tasted very familiar. And while the Duke and Hardy were negotiating, because it was the butler who designed the fountain, the girl wiped her mouth and thought that it was really not water, but pumpkin juice. Dion said that he initially wanted to build an artificial pond in the garden, but abandoned the idea for hygiene reasons. Meanwhile, Rotisen was looking down at her friend, saying that she was very cool because she had climbed to the first tier of the fountain and telling her to follow. The little girl began to blow out the candle on the pumpkin cake to the cheers of the audience. That day, the child was incredibly happy, always smiling and never stopped having fun. Watching her, the nanny thought she had never seen a child like that before. Holding hands outside, the girls said goodbye to each other, and Pieta said she would frame their drawing on the wall in her room, thanking them for the unforgettable day. Then, crying from Rotisen's words and gratitude, the little girl hugged her tightly. Dion and Daisy watched the scene with pleasure. They had managed to organize this friendship, and it was beautiful. As she lay in bed, she surprised the Duke and Daisy, who were looking at the girl in puzzlement, saying that she wished they could be as happy as she was today. The little girl asked if Rotisen had arrived home, and then if she would come back again, and Daisy and the Duke smiled and said that she would. At that moment, the Duke was thinking about his own thoughts, looking at his daughter, and Daisy thought she knew what he was thinking about. The girl holding onto her cloak understood one thing. Even though everything in the palace had become calm again after the holiday, she was only getting more nervous with each passing day. Excited about the guild meeting, she looked around when the Duke called out to her, drawing her attention. Hanston stood in unusual clothes for him, a black shirt with ties and no jabot, and looked at the girl. Holding Daisy's cloak, he told her once again not to stray too far from him, because everything could go wrong. But the author was sure that there was no need to worry, because she could be useful as she remembered many of the novel's characters. She recalled how they chose the name for the character they were looking for. Her maths friend had never been anywhere, so she came up with the names of her favorite places, and it made it easier now. As she got into the carriage, she thought that she didn't know the hero's appearance, but everything else was right. She thought that she would play the main role today. In the bar, where they were sitting with their hoods pulled up, everyone was having fun, drinking, and some even slept with their faces to the table. Straightening his hood, the Duke of Hanston looked at the girl who had called him daddy and asked her not to do so again. The Duke explained that the meeting was in a bar because the guards always go around all the hot spots where fraudsters could gather. The Duke was embarrassed when he caught the glances, although the girl thought he stood out because of his figure and black cloak, because he did not belong here. Daisy was angry because someone couldn't serve the customers properly, so she turned to see who it was, and she was jealous of Kyung Ho Wan. She glared at the Duke, pointing at the man who had recently been at their table, but he just kept his head down and told her to keep quiet. The author couldn't understand what Ken Ho Wan was doing here, and she was surprised that he was serving beer. As she sat there, holding her cloak with her hand, she realized that the Duke was worried about her. So many of his men were now sitting or working in the pub so that he could be sure of her safety. The girl saw an empty table where the group had been sitting. It was very strange for everyone to go to the toilet together. Hanston folded his hands in a lock in front of him, placing his elbows on the table and saying that the meeting was about to begin. Thinking about the secret place, she remembered something, which she shared now, whispering almost in Hanston's ear. There are stairs leading to the basement in the bar. Daisy began to tell me that she knew about the stairs because she had been here once with Polyp, and he had fallen down them because he was drunk. The Duke began to say thoughtfully that he did not think he and the boy were so close that they would go to such places together. It was clear that he was jealous. The girl, as soon as she realized what he was getting at, immediately began to tell him that they were here with other bar staff on holiday. But their little argument stopped as soon as they saw the boy enter the basement. They both followed him with their eyes. Pulling up his hood, Hanston was determined to follow, telling the girl to stay as close to him as possible. In the basement, the door to a room was open and voices could be heard, which attracted their attention when Dion and Daisy went downstairs. Saying that he would go first, the Duke took the girl's hand to keep her close and prevent her from getting into trouble. Several men were sitting at the table, and one of them, wearing a red hood, put his feet up on the table and folded his arms across his chest, behaving like a master. The girl looked thoughtfully through the crack, wondering if the man was the head of the guild, but she couldn't see his face. The stranger looked at the paper in his hands, talking about a new order for the guild. Daisy was disappointed to hear that the meeting was over, because everyone had been given their assignments, but she needed to learn more about the male character. With eyes bugging out and not believing her ears, she heard about the next meeting, putting the puzzle together in her head. She was excited to tell the Duke about the Maldives, because they were definitely connected with the Santorini family name. They were right. The Duke frowned when he heard the question about the guild head's son and his health, as this was the most interesting part of the meeting. Taking off her hood, a young girl with blue hair said that everything was fine, and he was recovering while she played with her braid. But then she threw the knife straight into the wall by the door, saying that if her son did not come to, she knew what she would do. Turning around, the Duke and the author began to walk away quickly to avoid being caught. As she ran after Hanston, she thought that she and Lapel were lucky, because this minor character was damn scary and bloodthirsty. She did not have time to stop in time, crashing into the Duke's back and screaming. Everyone in the bar was looking directly at them, and some even folded their arms across their chests, keeping their eyes on the two figures on the basement threshold. One of the men, looking quite intimidating, asked who they were and what they were doing in the basement. The girl was scared because now she realized that all these people were not ordinary bar patrons. But the strangers didn't like the fact that they were silent. Now they were talking louder, demanding answers. Remaining calm, the Duke rather rudely told the man to piss off, threatening to tear off their hoods along with their faces if they did not remove them themselves. He stared at the Duke's figure. Hanston simply threw off his hood, showing his face, while Daisy still stood in a cape behind him. When a buzz spread through the bar because everyone recognized the Duke of Hanston, the thug shouted for everyone to shut up. Now he was communicating better, but he said that now was not the time to ask the guild for anything, because there were too many people in the bar, and the Duke clearly did not want to join the guild. Remaining calm and smiling a little, the Duke said that the man was right, but that this place was not suitable for him, and he only wanted to get to know the bar. But soon both Daisy and the Duke were frightened. The man threatened to spread rumors around the city that the Duke was secretly meeting a girl in this bar. The thug held the author by the shoulder, trying to take her away from the Duke, but the latter clutched her hand tightly to prevent him from taking her away. The man was hinting at a bribe so that his boyfriend would not be told about the visit. Hanston remained true to his character, speaking calmly and saying that he was aware of the upcoming gossip, but that he was here on a civic mission. The bar owner did not give up, saying that it would be his civic mission to help financially, and that the guild does not give second chances to anyone. But the Duke, frowning, stood his ground. He said he would spare the man's life if he let the girl go right now. Dion looked at the bar owner the way one usually looks at dust on the road, realizing his superiority over a guild member. Enraged and unable to get help from the other guys in the bar, the thug roared and swung his fist at the Duke, who stood motionless in front of him. But nothing happened. The surprised bar owner looked back at the question about the Duke, and Daisy looked at the door in bewilderment. The Knights of Pontypill appeared in the bar and began arresting everyone in the main hall of the bar, telling everyone to move and leave. The Duke said, a little bored and calmly, that there were people in the basement, so that the Knights would take every single one of them out of the place. Hanston held Daisy with one arm as he left the bar and walked past the crowd on both sides of the road. Everyone whispered, not believing their eyes because it was the Duke himself, but he just looked at the author, who was clearly uncomfortable. The girl's eyes glazed over when she heard about how they were discussing her, and how the Duke was hugging her too affectionately, and that perhaps he had found the strength to move on. She could feel all those eyes on her and the Duke, feeling uncomfortable about it. The carriage slowly drove away from the bar, leaving the place where the guild had recently gathered. Sitting in the carriage with his arms folded across his chest, the Duke asked if Daisy was frightened, and explained that the knight's arrival had taken some time. Raising her hands, which had been shaking before, the girl said she was glad that everything had worked out and that she would never have thought she would need the help of the knights. Smiling and a little embarrassed, the author admitted that she could not even imagine how powerful the Duke of Hanston was. Looking at her, he said only what he had mentioned before. He would never let her go anywhere where it would be dangerous. Daisy's eyes widened as it began to dawn on her that the Duke had told the knights where they were long before, but hadn't told her because he wanted to anticipate something that might get out of hand. And then the girl blushed as she looked at him, realizing that she was the person to whom the Duke had a special relationship. The color spilled over the Duke's cheeks as he said, without looking up, that he would like to talk about bees and what had happened in the wine cellar. He was ashamed to admit it, because he still didn't look at the girl, blushing and saying that he didn't remember anything from that night. The Duke explained that he was talking about bees when he said that this time she was in trouble, and the next time it might be him. They were both very embarrassed. The author was surprised by what he said, because he said that he did not want her to think that he was shameless, especially her. She thought that this was very unusual for her, because before a kiss was the beginning of a relationship for her. But now everything was different. Thinking that it would be better, Daisy smiled awkwardly, telling the Duke to forget everything that had happened and apologizing for everything. He coughed awkwardly, asking why he had to forget everything because he didn't want to. Daisy couldn't believe what she was thinking. He had never kissed her because he was busy raising a child, but she was sure. Chestnut had definitely had something to do with it. The next day, the girl was shocked to learn that the guild leader's mother worked as a therapist for the mercenaries of the Alps. While she was thinking that her friend was apparently eager to go on holiday, the Duke continued his story calmly and with aristocratic mannerism. But Daisy didn't understand why the father and son didn't turn to Count Santorini for help, since he had connections and money. Hanston was sure that they simply did not know that they were related to the Count, so it did not happen. The author was sure that the guild leader knew about the relationship because his son would be the leader of the Santorini Guild in the future, which suggests that his father was aware of the family ties. Tapping his forearm with his finger and folding his arms across his chest, the Duke said that one should be on the lookout for a leader who might take advantage of these connections. She thought about what the Duke was saying, because the Count had received the title for his military merits, so being related to the guild leader would have raised many questions from the public. Looking at the author, Hanston said that he would not trust anyone who was in any way involved in the affairs of the guild in any matter. Daisy, after the Duke's words, thought cheerfully about the fact that she had appeared at the mansion when she was accused of stealing while he was reaching for the kettle. Seeing this, the girl said she would pour him a drink, reaching for the kettle. However, the Duke said it was not for him and pointed to Daisy's empty cup, surprising her. While Hanston poured her tea, the girl thought about how she had previously seen the Duke do things only for Pieta, and it confused her. Hearing that the Count loved children and helped the orphanage after he received the title, she couldn't help but wonder. It was a sign of a good person. Sitting at the dining room table across from the Count, the nanny and the girl, Count Santorini laughed heartily. Mala clung to Daisy in fear, trying to hide in her arms, for she was very afraid of the Count. Clutching the child to her, the girl listened in amazement to the Count, who was talking about the hairstyles of the new recruits, but she hadn't thought that Pieta would be so afraid of the old man. The plan to talk to the Count was failing, until he said with a smile that none of those recruits had a hairstyle like little Pieta's. The Duke looked at his daughter, looking serious and telling her to stop behaving like that and sit up straight. Turning her head to the guest, the little girl looked at the Count with huge eyes, asking him if he was a lamb because his beard reminded her of this animal. Count Santorini laughed heartily after this question, blushing with mirth. Surprising everyone, the old man began to say that he loved sheep, so he grew them on his face and wore them as a beard, and that the little girl was the first to know his secret. The Count allowed the girl to touch the sheep, holding out his hands and laughing, saying that they loved to make new friends. When she touched the beard, she was pleased to hear the Count's stomach rumbling. She put broccoli in the old man's beard so that the lambs would not starve. The Duke and Daisy rose from their seats, calling out to the child, both of them surprised by what she had done. But the Count just laughed when he took out the broccoli, saying that everything was fine and that my lady just wanted to feed the lambs. The nanny told Pieta that this was not the way to do things, and the Duke apologized to his guest with his hand to his forehead. After dinner, the Count, holding a glass of wine in his hand, thanked the Duke as he had no family to spend such lovely and family-like evenings with his relatives. Sitting down by the couch where Pieta slept, Santorini said that he would be happy to have a grandchild like this little girl. The Duke, sitting calmly and confidently with his hands clasped together, said that the Count had relatives, a daughter and a grandson. The old man turned, looking at the Duke, who continued to tell his story in disbelief. He was listening to the Duke's story in confusion, telling the story of Santorini's life and service in the Alps when he met the girl. The guild leader was screaming, pounding on the bars with her fists to bring her son. But then the Duke of Hanston appeared, calmly and silently opening the door of her cell without answering anything. Looking down at the girl, he apologized for separating her from her son, but said he did not need a reason to detain members of the illegal group. She screamed, asking what he wanted from them, while the Duke pulled out a chair. She couldn't believe that if it was just about the guild, he would touch her son. A few seconds later, she looked at the Duke's back in confusion, not believing what he had said, because he was sure that in the future she and her son would influence the fate of his daughter. Her son now appeared on the doorstep of her cell, happy to see his mother, holding the hand of the old Count of Santorini, who was smiling. The girl fell to her knees and hugged her son tightly, holding him close. She turned warily to the Earl's voice, asking who he was and how he knew her name when he asked if her name was really Andy Neretta. Blushing a little, he now asked if her mother's name was really Celine Neretta, and looked at his daughter. The old man showed me a gold medallion with a photo of a beautiful young woman. Andy's eyes bugged out, not understanding what was going on here and asking him directly about it, as well as why he had a photo of her late mother. The Count fell to the floor and sobbed, saying that he did not know his daughter existed, while she mocked, saying that she did not know he was of blue blood, although his mother had mentioned him before her death. The girl was furious. She shouted at the old man to shut up and not to talk about her mother, thinking that he had come to get rid of unwanted relatives. The Count was sobbing on the floor while the girl shouted that she didn't want to know him, and Daisy looked at Andy in surprise. The author touched the Count's back to support him. Daisy began to defend the Count, saying that he had temporarily moved to another place because he was a mercenary, and at the same time her mother had moved to another place, and it was not his fault that he had abandoned them. But after the Duke asked if her mother had spoken ill of Santorini, the girl cooled down, although she said it was too late and asked why he had come now. The author asked me not to say such things, because Andy might not see her son grow up if she continued to live the way she did. She continued, saying that hatred of her father was not the most important thing in life, and that she could ruin her own son's life. The Duke wanted to support the girl, so he looked at her and said that her mother definitely wanted her to be happy, just like his own. Andy stared silently at one point, her face reflecting the grief for her mother, whom she was now remembering in her last moments. Raising his head, the Count sobbed openly, asking for her forgiveness. The girl watched her father beat himself up and blamed himself for everything that had happened. She was almost crying from all the emotions she was feeling. Turning away, Andy put her hand to her mouth, stifling her sobs. Her whole body shook with tears. Daisy also cried watching this scene, and was surprised when the Duke came up to her, hugging her with one arm and taking her hand in the other, squeezing it. Without saying anything, Hanston reached out, running his thumb across her face to wipe away the tears that had frozen in her eyes. He hugged the girl and calmed her down, while she buried her face in his chest, crying and shaking with sobs. The next day, Daisy was sitting with her papers in front of the Duke, who was drinking tea, and looked surprised when he told her that she was holding a knighthood application form. Hanston said that he was thinking of changing the leadership of the guild if he became a knight, and asked the author what she thought about it. Looking at the Duke, she realized that the truce was still far away, but it was a step towards it. And the Duke was doing it for the sake of a minor character, which also pleasantly surprised her. The Duke stood up from his seat, putting his hands in his pockets and telling him that the academy could break the boy, because everyone there was from noble families, but that becoming a knight was different. Looking at the documents he took from Daisy's hands, Hanston said that knights are taught discipline and order, so this would only benefit the boy. The Duke thought about whether Andy would return to the guild after being asked if she would return to the guild, and remembered that the Count was watching over her and guiding her on the right path. Leaning on the table and folding his arms across his chest, the Duke was pleased with himself, saying that he would not interfere with their family, but that he would be informed of the state of affairs in Santorini. Daisy was surprised when he called him by his title, but he corrected her by saying his first name, which surprised her even more. He looked into her eyes when he told her that she could call him by his first name, Dion. Leaning over, the Duke said that this would not do when the author began to ask how she could call him that, because she had called him many other names in the bar, and he did not like it. After coughing awkwardly, he said that he needed to train to avoid such situations in the future. Daisy looked at the Duke and thought that social status mattered here, and whether a commoner like her could call the Duke by his first name. Blushing and stuttering, Daisy agreed. The Duke came closer, touching her cheek with his fingers, gently and carefully, making the girl glare at him. He said that Daisy had done a very good job so far, and he hoped that she would continue to do so. Spellbound, the girl addressed the Duke by his title, but immediately corrected herself by calling him by his first name. He smiled with satisfaction when she corrected him, saying that he now liked the way she called him. A few seconds later, she was holding the bag Dion had given her, who had been wanting to give it to her for a long time but hadn't had the chance and wondered what it was. When she opened it, she saw a pile of gold coins and heard the Duke's voice saying that she had been working for him for a month, and that this was her salary. He was surprised why the girl asked about silver, because he had previously told her that he would give her a raise if she worked hard. The girl was pleasantly surprised by what Dion did, smiling at him and still not believing her own eyes. And while the author rejoiced at her payment, the Duke turned away in embarrassment, coughing again. Left alone with himself, all Hanston could think about was Daisy's lips. He didn't understand what was happening to him, because it had never happened before, and he remembered how beautiful she was when she just smiled. His thoughts were interrupted by Hardy, who was asked by the Duke whether he had been having a hard time over the past few days. On reflection, the butler said that the Duke had actually turned down many cases because he said he would be doing something else. Trying not to think about Hardy's words, he decided to change the subject and asked where his daughter was now. When the Duke learned that Pieta was painting a gift in honor of Daisy's 30 days as a nanny, he was surprised. Had so much time passed? As Daisy walked around the city, she kept thinking that Chestnut had refused to walk around the city, citing her own work. And yet, as she walked, she thought that it would be nice to walk alone. Walking among the people, the author thought that today was the perfect day to spend her first salary. The girl from the shop where they had been before Pieta's birthday greeted Daisy cheerfully, saying she was glad to see her back. When she heard that the client was choosing a gift for her child and adult men, she smiled and pointed to the right place so that they could find something suitable together. In front of her was a beautiful hair hoop with pumpkins, which Pieta loved so much. Overjoyed, the girl said that this hoop was a one-of-a-kind, but she had put it aside just in case. After choosing a gift for Chestnut, Daisy couldn't wait for the other gift options offered by the girl consultant. With her arms folded across her chest and several bags by her side, she was serious, because it was time for the most difficult choice. The consultant showed us a pen encrusted with diamonds from the Del Sur continent, which would be the perfect gift for the Duke. The nanny was fascinated by the beauty of the pen, and her mouth dropped open. She thought about how the color of the stone reminded her of Dion's eyes and decided to buy it, because the gift was worth it. As she left the store, Daisy held a pile of packages in her hands, thinking she had bought too much. The last point was the Shanu restaurant, where she went to greet her aunt. Here you could buy a lot of sweets for the kids. With a twinkle in her eye, the aunt put her head on her folded hands and asked if Daisy wanted to tell her something. The author was speechless, looking at the old woman when she said that there were rumors that a girl had appeared who had managed to fall in love with a duke. After pouring 2 glasses of wine, the aunt began her story again, first asking if she had heard about the arrest of the illegal organization a few days earlier. The old woman folded her arms and sparkled her eyes, saying that the Duke had gone to rescue his beloved, who had been kidnapped by the guild. Daisy was speechless when she heard this. She could not believe that such gossip had spread. While the girl was blushing, the old woman said that people could feel her incredible beauty even through the cloak she was wearing, which hid her face. The girl wiped her mouth, choking on her wine and saying that everything was fine, although she was thinking about how distorted the rumors were. Closing her eyes, she remembered the day the guild was arrested, because she was there with the Duke. The old woman asked if she really didn't know anything, but when Daisy said no, the aunt turned to the voice of one of the restaurant guests. The young man said that there were new rumors, not even paying attention to his wife, who asked him to keep quiet. With the look of a man who knows a secret, the man said that he had heard it from his cousin's brother, and that the Duke's beloved was a princess from another country. Unable to stand the gossip, Daisy quickly got up from her seat, saying that time was flying by and she had to go. After saying goodbye very quickly, she turned on the threshold and waved, promising to come back later. At the same time, in the palace, Hardy was holding letters, telling the Duke that he needed to check something. But he saw a kid drawing a picture, saying that she also wanted to go with Daisy, but lamented that she had too much to do. Leaning over the girl, Hardy praised her with a smile, saying that the drawing was getting better and better. The butler smiled and talked about the pangs of creativity, while Pieta sighed that painting was a delicate thing and nothing came out easily. The boy looked at the girl who said that Daisy needed to rest sometimes. He did not think that my lady would say something like that. She turned back to the drawing and told Hardy to go away, as she needed to concentrate on her work. After a while, Pieta looked at the drawing she had finally completed with joy. She couldn't get enough of what she had created. The girl ran up to her father, drawing his attention and telling him to look at what she had drawn. Kashtanchik showed me drawings. The first one was of her with pumpkins, the second one of a sheep eating broccoli. The third picture showed Dad and Daisy standing next to each other. Hanston praised his daughter with a smile, saying that each new drawing was getting better and better. As he praised Pieta, the Duke thought about how much his daughter liked Daisy and considered his own gift. The little girl jumped joyfully from her father's arms, greeting her nanny who had finally returned to the palace. The girl picked Pieta up in her arms, happy and laughing at the number of questions she asked about what she had done and whether she had had fun. The Duke called the girl, asking her if she would go to the island with him tomorrow, which surprised her. The girl put her hand to her chin and thought about what she should do and how to behave. Opening the door to her room, Pieta appeared on the threshold and immediately asked what her nanny was doing. She looked at Daisy, who smiled and said she was packing. The girl saw her pumpkin album and showed it to her nanny, saying that it was hers. The girl smiled and said that she had approached the training very responsibly so as not to forget anything, as she had not traveled for a long time. The author jumped up from the floor when the girl sadly said, with her back turned to her, that she was not going anywhere, so there was no need to worry about her. Clutching her bag, the little girl was almost crying, saying that she would go with Daisy next time, and that she and her dad should go alone. Saying that there was no point in her going if my lady wasn't going, she angered the little girl, who screamed in disbelief. Pieta was surprised to hear that adults could not just go somewhere together. When she heard that the nanny still wanted to go to the island, the little girl happily said that she agreed to go there. As Daisy hugged the girl, she was excited with her, because they were going to have fun together. Turning her head back to the bed, the author thought that the last thing she needed to worry about were the gifts she had bought to celebrate her first month on the job. Standing by the side of the ship, Pieta pointed in wonder at the birds flying above their ship, so that Daisy could see them. The nanny gently took the girl in her arms, telling her that it was seagulls and that it was very dangerous to hang on the bulwarks. The little girl was still looking at the seagulls with big eyes, asking what they were eating. Pieta cheered up the nanny by saying that she wanted to give them fish because they had it every day at home. Putting the child on deck, Daisy immediately ran to Hardy, who was hanging over the side and vomiting. Watching the butler's illness, the Duke calmly said that he had offered him to stay at home for this very reason, but he refused. Raising her hand in a gesture of support, the little girl encouraged Hardy to keep going. Daisy thought to herself with a smile that it was very strange that the two were so friendly. As soon as they docked, Pieta went off to Hardy, saying she would go with him, while Daisy caught a woof, thinking they had arrived too quickly. The servants bowed as one, welcoming the Duke to the island. Daisy was surprised that there were servants on the island as well, and the Duke, who was standing nearby, said that was why they could come there at any time. As she followed the Duke, the girl wondered how large the Duke's domain really was. She stopped in surprise, looking at the boy, who gave her his hand with a smile, saying that he had a long way to go, and asked for her hand to accompany him. The Duke looked jealously at one of his servants, giving Daisy a hand, looking back. He took her hand first, telling her in a serious tone to watch her feet. The servant looked on in awe as the Duke took the girl's hand, putting his own hand to his mouth in a fit of emotion. Holding the Duke's hand, Daisy walked with him with a smile. When they approached the palace on the island, he and Pieta were offered freshly squeezed juice. Looking at the woman with the tray and the beautiful clothes, she thought that she must be wearing a traditional local dress, which was very beautiful. They settled down on the sofas. The Duke sat quietly with his leg up. Pieta ran around the house and Daisy drank juice. The girl pulled the surprised nanny by the hand, telling her to come with her because she wanted to play by the sea. After changing clothes, they went to the beach. The little girl ran to the sea in awe, while the author opened her mouth in amazement at the beautiful scenery, not even noticing Hardy and the Duke walking behind her. Pierrette, sitting on the shore at high tide, happily called out to her nanny to come to her. Smiling and now thinking that Pieta was not Chestnut on the island but Tomato, Daisy went to the girl, who was now calling for her father. The Duke was sitting on a sunbed and propping his head up with his hand, watching his daughter and her nanny, who were a little further away. Looking around, the author said that her father had decided to rest, and thought to herself that today the Duke looked completely different from his usual self. Only when she turned to the kids who called her did Daisy get hit in the face with a starfish. And then, with a laugh, the girl would cover herself from the water Pieta splashed on her. The Duke appeared next to the nanny, putting his hand on her shoulder and surprising her with his appearance. He asked his daughter to stop being a fool. Heidi approached my lady and whispered something in her ear, coming up with a plan that would work. Daisy and Dion looked at what was happening in confusion, trying to understand what Chestnut and the butler were talking about. Seeing Hardy take a palm leaf, the author stepped in for the Duke, who warned the butler not to do what he was planning. Hardy and Pieta laughed heartily, and the little one was delighted when the butler splashed her father with water. The Duke stood silently, soaking wet as Daisy asked if he was all right. But the Duke did not wait for another towel. He simply took off his shirt because it was wet to wipe himself with the one the girl gave him. Daisy bowed her head, blushing at the sight of Dion's shirtlessness, thinking to herself that she had no idea how fit he was. Pieta watched with satisfaction as her nanny was embarrassed, and her father tried to get the towel she was holding. Daisy handed the Duke a clean towel to wipe himself clean. Hardy was just having fun with my lady in the water, leading his dances when the Duke called him. The next second, he was in no mood for jokes. The Duke informed him that he would cut his salary for that month. He couldn't believe it, asking questions. And then, to the surprised look of Daisy, who was holding a towel to her chest, the Duke announced that he was going to his room and turned around and went into the room. While the little girl was praising Hardy and asking what a pay cut was, the author looked around, wondering what was happening to the Duke. The Duke was increasingly distracted from his merriment, but if you looked closely, you could see that his ears were reddened with embarrassment. Nanny and Chestnut were holding their stomachs, closing their eyes and saying that they were both full. They all turned towards the sunset, which was slowly touching the sea line on the horizon. Everyone looked at the incredible view in amazement. She tried to remember the last time she had sat in such an atmosphere and watched the sunset. Thinking that now was the perfect time for gifts, Daisy presented the first Pieta with a box of her favorite color, surprising the child. The little girl began to cheer loudly, and Daisy looked back at the Duke and the butler, who were looking at it all in surprise, embarrassed. She wanted to present the gift as quietly as possible. Now Heidi opened his present, surprised that he hadn't expected to receive anything from Daisy. He was echoed by the child, who was eagerly tearing off the wrapping. The little girl happily put on the pumpkin hula hoop, asking her nanny how she looked with the new thing. Hardy thanked her for the gift while Pieta climbed into the girl's arms, hugging her in gratitude. She looked around and saw the Duke, who was drinking tea in his calm manner and watching everything that was happening in front of him. But the girl realized with teary eyes that she didn't have the courage to get a gift for the Duke, and tried to convince herself that she should give it to him as casually as to others. And while the nanny was finding the strength to give the most important gift, Pieta shouted to Hardy that the sun had already set, attracting his attention. Taking the girl's hand, both of them under questioning glances and questions about where they were going, Hardy left the terrace. Daisy was confused when the baby said that it was not hot outside, and they were going for a walk, and asked her not to follow them. She also stopped her father, who also wanted to go with them, saying that he could not go either. The Duke was equally surprised by this reaction, and to looks of incomprehension, the How to Marry a Duke duo quickly left. When she got up from her seat, she was in a panic. It would soon be night, and that was dangerous for her because she remembered their card game. With his arms locked in front of him, the Duke looked at the girl, waiting for his gift as she read in his eyes. Daisy blushed as she thought about how the gift would now have a double meaning, and that she should have given it away while they were all together. Dion coughed when the girl started to speak, causing her to stop talking in embarrassment and stare at him. The moment was ruined, and turning away, Daisy wondered whether she would even give the gift, while the Duke looked somewhere to the side and called her. Hanston took the author's hand, gently and carefully, as he always did with everything to do with her. Holding hands, they stared with sinking hearts at the sunset, which painted the sky in crimson shades. Daisy folded her arms over her chest, not believing her own eyes. The Duke was showing her thousands of fireflies circling above them. The Duke, looking at the girl, smiled, telling her that he was glad she liked it. When she returned to him, she thought that this day was the best gift, and she would always remember these moments. The surprised Duke looked at the blushing Daisy, who thanked him for bringing them along and handed him a small box with a gift. She began to make excuses, saying that the gift was small and that he might already have one, but she wanted to thank him. The Duke smiled, admitting that he thought there would be no gift for him. He was looking at the box in his hands the whole time. Hanston looked at the fountain pen, examining it and noticing the stone that Daisy said reminded her of his eyes. After a short pause, the Duke smiled broadly, still holding the gift and assuring me that he would treasure it very much. The girl was very happy to hear these words, because she was worried that the Duke would not like the gift. When she met the Duke's eyes, she almost immediately turned back to the sea, saying that next time she would choose something better while he was still looking at her. Still a little red, she thought about how beautiful it was around her, squeezing her hands into the frame and leaving the thought that she was suddenly hot. The Duke, who agreed that it was beautiful, made the girl turn to him. He blushed, embarrassed, but looked at Daisy. And then he turned to face the ocean. Now they were staring out there, both of them, and Daisy kept wondering if he had said it, looking in front of her and thinking about the silence that had fallen around them. Daisy felt a tickle on her face, now waving her arms and trying to shake off the bugs that were flying in all directions. The Duke, while the girl was nervous about the fireflies, tried to explain that she had become so much more because of the sea nearby, and looked at her with incomprehension. Shooing the fireflies away from the girl, the Duke led her in the direction of the house. The next morning, the author was going through her things to check that she had packed everything when a joyful Pieta flew out to her. She was horrified to see how she and Hardy were all red but still happy. The girl watched them both scratching themselves, saying that there were too many mosquitoes in the room. After telling them to wait, the nanny started looking for a remedy to help them, but she didn't notice the firefly that was in one of her clothes. When they returned to the palace, Pieta was standing in front of her room door with a gift in her hair, asking her to come in as soon as possible. Daisy stared at the door, realizing that she hadn't known that another gift was waiting for her. Taking her nanny's hand, the girl pulled her along while she watched her lovely face in awe. She happily showed her several sheets of paper, saying that she would explain everything on them. The nanny looked at the first drawing in amazement, not believing that the girl had drawn it for her. It was the scene when they first met, and she gave the girl pumpkin candy. Then the little girl showed me another drawing, saying that it was Pieta herself with a pumpkin. But the girl stopped rejoicing when she heard a familiar voice. The Duke, folding his arms across his chest and leaning on the doorframe, said that his daughter had never painted so much before. She showed me more and more pictures she had drawn. There were many scenes that made both Pieta and her nanny happy. The author hugged the girl when she saw the last drawing, the one that showed her, the Duke, the little girl, and the butler inside a large heart. She sincerely thanked the child for her gift. Daisy was overcome with emotion, tears welling up in her eyes as she assured the child that she loved the gift. Hardy and Hanston watched the scene unfold before their eyes with smiles. After hanging the framed paintings on her wall, Daisy made it a habit to look at them, remembering the wonderful moments the child had painted. She was interrupted by a girl who reached out to her, running into her room and asking if she wanted to read a book together. And while Pieta was walking confidently, the author thought about why she was so excited because it was just reading a book. And when they entered the library, the Duke looked questioningly at the girl, who was equally surprised to see Hanston in the room. The little girl immediately turned and ran away, while Daisy couldn't take her eyes off her father, wondering what he was doing here. He said that Pieta had pulled him out of the office, and now they were both looking at the girl, who had taken the book and was lying on the floor on her stomach, opening the book. The nanny wondered if the baby really wanted to read, as she changed one book after another and concluded that the baby was simply unbearable. When there was a knock, the girl jumped up saying it must be Hardy, to her nanny's complete surprise. Both of them were puzzled by Hardy's behavior, not understanding what was happening to him, because he was so sweet, holding a quality letter in his hand. Reading a letter from the imperial palace, the Duke propped his head up with his fist, telling himself that this day had come too soon. Pieta asked if they would go dancing because she wanted to. The Duke was clearly not the type of person who wanted to be there. And Daisy asked what kind of dancing they were talking about. The girl wondered what the Duke was talking about when he lamented that he would be tormented again with talk of marriage. Hardy joked to the Duke's confusion that he regretted it, because this year the Duke already had a pair, because he would not have minded wearing a dress. The girl could not stand it, turning to the butler and asking what was happening and whether there would be an event in the palace. Daisy listened to the story of the royal family, who held a ball every year and who was sure to attend, putting two and two together in her head. She asked if they really meant to say that the entire royal family, along with one of the younger princes, would attend the ball. Turning to the girl, the Duke looked at her with incomprehension, saying that the prince she was talking about was still young. She knew the royal family, of course, and thought only that the ball was an opportunity to meet another male protagonist, Edward Chester, who was Chestnut's age. She recalled how excited she was when she created this particular character on her own. In the future, the guy will become a tyrant who breaks up families, putting on a mask of friendliness, and the only thing he cares about is his long, rust-colored hair. Although Daisy thought he was her type, he is now as small and cute as Chestnut. And the very next second, Hardy surprised her by saying that this was the only event where members of the Magic Tower appeared. The Duke turned to the girl, saying that they needed to talk and distracting her from her own thoughts. Looking at her husband, the author realized that he also remembers, because she told him everything on the day they met. Walking in the garden, Dais listened to Dayon say that he remembered her story, where the head of the tower and the second prince would play an important role in Pieta's life. The girl assured the Duke that she had really created it herself, and that is why she remembers it in the smallest detail. She didn't believe that her character would be at the ball, recalling that he would become emperor because his brother would not be interested in the throne, and that is how he would appear in Pieta's life. The author, looking at the Duke, asked him what the words about marriage that Hardy had said earlier meant. Turning to the girl sideways and looking somewhere in the garden, the Duke said that he was still alone, and the clock was still ticking. Embarrassed, she didn't know why she had asked, so she said with a smile that they had to get back to Pieta because she was the most important thing right now. The Duke turned to the girl in confusion, and abruptly when she said that Pieta and the second prince might become relatives in the future. And then he turned his back on her and walked away, telling her to forget what he had asked. Daisy was completely baffled by Dion's behavior. Embarrassed, the Duke spoke about the ball, and the girl looking at him thought about who exactly was the most coveted guest. Looking at the Duke, she realized that he rarely appeared in public, so this ball would be the only opportunity to see the Duke, and the first beauties would come from all over the country. Realizing that she was exhaling loudly and feeling uneasy, she put her hand over her mouth and thought that she needed to change the subject immediately so that the Duke would not notice her mood. She tried to explain that she wanted to look at Prince Edward, laughing, even though she had surprised the Duke by asking him if he would go to the ball with the servants. Her words were obvious, even though Daisy did not understand why she was behaving this way today. So she asked the Duke to forget what she had said, embarrassed. And the very next moment, surprising Dion, she turned around and walked away, saying that she had to go to work. In the evening, Hardy stood in the Duke's office and wondered why he had decided to write a response to the invitation so soon after Hanston had started writing. He frowned as he wrote, thinking that he would have been bombarded with invitations if he hadn't delayed his response and sent it so quickly. The Duke looked up from his paper and saw that the butler was looking at what he was writing, so he asked him to leave the office. Standing outside the door, ashamed, the butler thought that the Duke was colder than usual. But his thoughts were interrupted by my lady. She was running, asking the boy how everything went. The girl, clenching her fists, asked if her father was going to the ball, and Hardy, coughing, said that the Duke had most likely decided to go. Pieta was delighted, her eyes sparkling, and she shouted that Daddy would definitely go to the ball with Daisy. After Hardy asked her to keep her voice down, the girl apologized and started to whisper, making the boy laugh softly and stroke her hair. The butler recalled that the Duke was too cautious when he replied to the letter, and that he did not even think that Hanston was hiding his feelings so carefully. Mala brought the boy back to reality, supporting him and telling him not to worry because he had her. And suddenly he realized she was right. He had nothing to worry about. The next morning, Daisy and Pieta sat at the table, wondering if the Duke had left for Utena and would return only tomorrow. While the nanny ate, glaring at Hardy, Kashtanchik shamed the boy, reminding him that he was supposed to wake her up and didn't. The girl threw up her hands in resentment, saying that Hardy always laughed at her when he said that the Duke had come to see her and even kissed her before he left. Daisy looked at the girl in surprise when she asked if she was bored with her. With a child's spontaneity, Pieta said, holding up a finger, that the nanny missed her dad when he was away. All the servants stared at the girl and her nurse, unable to believe their ears and frozen in place. Leaning down, the author asked the child why he should be sad when the Duke was not around. Hardy decided to save the day, and announcing that there were a lot of breadcrumbs on my lady's clothes, picked her up and carried her out of the dining room. She understood that the absence of the Duke was a chance for these two gray cardinals, and she was determined to expose them both. Now she watched as Hardy, after looking around a few times, knocked on the door of Pieta's room, telling her that it was him, and she could open it. Hearing them talking about how they didn't have much time for anything, the girl smiled. She knew they were up to something. Daisy threw open the door with a sharp movement, screaming that they were caught red-handed. But she saw Hardy standing on the steps, pulling out a drawing box, and he and Pieta looking at the nanny questioningly. Jumping up to the girl, Kashtanchik told her that Rodasan, whom she missed so much, was coming today, so she sent a letter with an invitation. Mala began to push Hardy to give her the paper as soon as possible, because she wanted to draw a picture and give it to her friend, finishing it before she arrived. She started to apologize to the guy because it was her job, but she was so busy spying that she didn't do her job today. But they both smiled, saying that everything was fine. Hardy was happy to help the girl. They asked Daisy if she wanted to paint with them and looked like little devils. Kashtanchik waved her hands, forcing the nanny to go and paint faster because there was little time. But then Rodasan appeared, running happily to her friend, telling her that she had arrived. To make it faster, she slid down the railing, causing Daisy to scream as she was afraid that she would get hurt. The girls hugged each other, greeting each other and being happy to have met. Looking down at the children from the second floor, Daisy couldn't believe her eyes. Do they really like each other that much? Deciding that the investigation was closed, the nanny ran down the stairs to be with the girls. The author admired, with her hands to her face and smiling, the drawing of Pieta, who had drawn herself and Rodasan sitting next to her. As soon as Daisy went to get the goodies, Rodasan asked Chestnut if this was really the woman who would soon become her mum, putting her hand to her mouth. Closing her eyes, the little girl exhaled, saying that it was really her, but she did not know when it would happen. Rodasan said that she liked Daisy and, to Pieta's surprise, added that she wished her mother had been so kind. And then she put her hand on her friend's shoulder, supporting her with such a simple but sweet gesture. A few seconds later, they hugged each other, and Rodi assured me that she was happy for Pieta because they were friends. Gathering her courage, Kashtanchik asked her friend if she wanted to touch her head. She looked serious and with her hands at her sides, saying that it was a kind of ritual and very important. The girl was surprised to touch Pieta's hair, saying that it was very soft. The next day, Kashtanchik flew into her father's office, opening the door wide and attracting attention. She immediately found herself in the arms of her father, who, like the girl, was happy to see his daughter and hugged her. And while Pieta was telling her father about the guest they had, a breathless Daisy entered the study, leaning her hand on the door and saying that Pieta should not run around the palace like that. The girl stopped dead in her tracks when she saw who had returned home. The Duke immediately gave her his full attention, holding his daughter in his arms, her eyes sparkling with the plan she was now putting into action. As she approached the table, the author saw the pen she had given to the Duke, who seemed to be using it very actively. He smiled slightly and praised the nanny because she had done a great job, including with the guest his daughter had invited. They were interrupted by Hardy, who coughed and drew attention to himself. He held out an envelope, saying that the Imperial Palace had replied. Daisy looked down at the envelope in surprise, concluding that it was about the ball because what else could it be? The Duke sat down next to his daughter, who wanted to read the letter, smiling and touching her hair. She started reading, stopping at words she didn't know the meaning of. She poked the letter at her father to look at the word, while Hardy suggested that this was the person who would keep her company at the ball. They both looked happily at the Duke and Daisy, for they had already concluded who would accompany him to the ball. Daisy looked at the two in surprise, not knowing if they were really talking about her. To prevent anyone from disturbing him, the Duke asked his daughter and butler to leave, closing the door behind them. And then, sitting in his favorite position, he said that she would go to the ball with him. He didn't ask, he told her, and his tone didn't accept denial. The girl put her hand to her chest in amazement. She was an ordinary person without status and did not understand how she could be at the ball. The Duke, holding up the documents, said that he had taken care of everything and informed her with his trademark face that did not reveal anything, that Daisy was now a member of Heidi's family, and she would not have any problems. Looking at the author, Hanston said that he hadn't told her about it before because he didn't want to bother her with such insignificant things. Daisy looked at Dion in surprise, thinking that he was really sincere in his words, and only nodded when he said that now there would be much less restrictions for her. And then she watched as the Duke came closer, saying that he was going to tell her something else after the girl thought that the problem was the lack of a title. Blushing, he admitted that from the very beginning he had wanted to go to the ball only with her, looking her in the eye and not hiding his emotions. The Duke held out his hand to Daisy, asking her again if she would do him the honor of going to the ball with him. Daisy put her hand in the Duke's, gesturing to his proposal. Dion smiled with satisfaction, saying that now no one would have any questions for the two of them. When it was time for the ball, the little girl ran out into the hall, asking if the nanny had forgotten anything, if she had put on her earrings and gloves. To Hardy's laughter, she folded her arms across her chest and assured him that she would not cause trouble until Daisy and Daddy were gone, because she was already 7 years old. The girl and the Duke said goodbye to Pieta, leaving her in the care of Hardy, who promised to look after her. As they rode in the carriage, the author kept thinking that she couldn't believe she was actually going to the ball. All the more reason not to miss the opportunity to meet a secondary character. She asked the Duke a little uncertainly if he had met the second prince before, as he had been to many such events. He said that he had met him a couple of times, but that he hadn't been able to meet him more often because he was still a child. Daisy thought about her character, who always neatly gathers his hair and the emerald brown eyes that match his hair color. She couldn't believe it was happening. The Duke was looking at her with a poker face as he listened to her rant, and then said that this description was very similar to Prince Glenn, Edward's older brother. The author put her hands to her mouth, asking what she should do, because she thought she would have to wait 15 years for her type of man to grow up. She raised her fists, excited to meet someone who looked so much like the character she had created. The Duke propped his head up with his hand, looking at the author, and only huffed. They arrived, now standing in the hall, where all the servants bowed and welcomed the Duke of Hanston on his arrival. Putting his hand on the girl's arm, which surprised her, Dion reassured her, saying that she shouldn't worry about anything. But they were interrupted by several girls who surprised Daisy, making her open her mouth. They greeted the Duke by running to him. Even men from aristocratic families rejoiced at his arrival, as the Duke was to become the centerpiece of the ball. The girls looked at the girl next to Hanston and realized that they were seeing her for the first time at a social event. Curtsying, Daisy bowed as a greeting while they discussed that she was the daughter of the Heidi family. Everyone looked at her, whispering to each other who Heidi's family was, because they had no idea who they were. While she was embarrassed, the Duke calmly told her that her family had been in contact with his clan for a long time, and that they were from a wealthy area of the city of Utina. She turned her head to him in surprise, because she remembered that he had recently gone there on business. He smiled at the girl, and she recalled his words where he asked her not to worry about anything. Finally, it was time for the dance. Everyone around them was already dancing, but the Duke and the author had just entered the middle of the hall. Holding out his hand to Daisy with a smile, Dion asked if she would like to dance with him. The girl, accepting the invitation, asked him not to mind if she stepped on his feet, to which the Duke only blushed and then smiled, saying that it was her first dance. While dancing, she felt awkward, scolding herself for being too nervous. Distracted by his breath on her forehead and his hands on her back, Daisy joked that this was indeed her first dance. They danced, not noticing anyone, only each other, while everyone in the audience looked at them. saying that they had finally managed to see the Duke of Hanston dancing. A little while later, she went outside and sat down on a bench and relaxed. Finally, she had this opportunity. She regretted leaving Dion alone, remembering how the other girls had attacked him, but thought he would be fine as he was used to such events. Daisy heard crying and looked over to see a boy hiding behind a tree, whimpering. She came a little closer, addressing the boy and asking if he had come here with his mother and if he was lost. But the boy jumped to his feet, turning to face her and shouting at her in tears, asking her what kind of impudence she had. He began to say that he was actually just resting here when he was interrupted. The girl realized who he was when she saw his hair and eyes, but while she was admiring him, the boy clenched his hands into fists angrily because he was being called. Daisy thought about what the boy had said, asking her to keep his secret, that he had been here, and then going into the arms of someone he called Hanum, who said he was bothering the servants again. She turned around and saw a handsome young man who looked almost like a copy of his little relative and was smiling at the girl. Trying to stay calm, Daisy was squealing with joy inside because she still couldn't believe she had met two minor characters she had invented herself. Holding his brother in his arms, the first prince asked her who she was. After she bowed and introduced herself, the prince smiled, saying that he was very much looking forward to meeting her. With a sweet smile, the prince said that his name was too long, so it would be better if she called him Glenn. At the same time, the boy looked at the girl in front of him. The guy said that the second part of the dance would be coming up soon, and asked if the girl would dance with the Duke of Hanston again. And while Daisy was surprised, the prince continued to speak, saying that he was surprised that the Duke came with an escort and even danced, and regretted that he had missed everything. The prince said that he had invited the painter to paint them because it was a historic moment, and asked her with a smile if she would dance with the Duke again. The girl looked at the prince in confusion, not believing what she was hearing because the paintings have been preserved for centuries. Bowing, the author apologized and said that it was impossible, thinking to herself that she would not want to create problems for Dion. After she told him about the order, the prince began to laugh loudly and incessantly, because his request was just that, a request. The girl did not answer the question whether he could call her Daisy, but only apologized and said that she had to return to the Duke, as she had left him alone for a long time. With a sly smile, Prince Glenn said that he would like to ask her something about the Duke of Hanston, but the Duke himself said he had to ask him personally, looking at the prince without a shadow of a smile. The prince started laughing, still holding his brother in his arms and saying that they had seen each other so long ago that he had begun to forget what Dion looked like. With a brief nod and a proper greeting, he greeted the two princes in front of him. Under the watchful eyes of the royal sons, the Duke turned to Daisy, saying that he had gone to look for her because he was worried, and she apologized for making him worry. They wanted to leave, but the eldest prince did not allow them to, saying that he still wanted to ask them something, and that they could be free after answering it. Dion and Daisy were not very happy. He became serious, saying that he had heard that the Duke had mobilized a detachment of knights to arrest the guild in Pontypool. Smiling sweetly, Glenn said that he had heard that the Duke had rescued a girl of unearthly beauty, and now asked if it was true. Once again, they were both confused, because after Hanston's assertion, the prince asked if it was not Daisy. Dion calmly replied that if the opportunity arose, he would definitely tell the prince about everything, because he was with a lady, and it was impolite to leave her to talk to him. Their conversation was interrupted by the maids, who were already teary-eyed. They had searched for the prince and were very happy to find him. The little boy in the arms of his smiling brother began to kick, and said that he had to run away when he saw the servants. Walking away with his brother and assuring him that it would not be for long, Glenn turned his head to the couple and said goodbye. After the prince winked at her, Daisy blushed and the Duke looked at her. He smiled when she corrected herself, calling him by his first name, and joked that she changes her style of speech depending on the environment, and assured her that he still likes it when she calls him that. They returned home much later than expected, and the girl tried to be quiet, but was surprised to see that Pieta was still awake. The Duke, taking his daughter in his arms, asked her with a surprised look if she hadn't really gone to bed yet. After putting Chestnut to bed in her crib, the Duke and the nanny were walking down the corridor, and she said it was time for her to go too. Hanston watched the girl go to her room as they said goodnight. He blushed a little, realizing that this was the first time in his life that he was nervous, because Daisy was with him tonight. He remembered sitting in the carriage, seeing Daisy's smile and her dreams of a ball, and realizing that he cared about her. He put his hand to his face, blushing even more and thinking about everything that had happened today. The Duke concluded that he was a complete fool. The next morning, a cheerful and smiling Daisy appeared in Pieta's room to wake her up. After picking up the child, who was still sleeping, Daisy jokingly said that he needed to have breakfast and could go back to sleep. Chestnut rubbed her eyes, thinking about the dream, and the girl looked at the empty dining room in surprise. They had started the day much later, but had Dion come down yet? Hardy frantically checked the Duke's schedule, thinking he had an appointment just by looking at my lord. The Duke looked incredible. A beautiful ruffled shirt and a white jabot with a blue stone in the middle, as well as cuffs on his arms, which he had never worn before. The Duke said with a tired look that he had nothing to do today, but he did not look very well, to put it mildly. Hardy was now trying to explain why he said that the Duke did not look the same as usual while he was throwing lightning bolts at him, already sitting at the table. Daisy complimented him, saying that it suited him very well. Everyone present noticed that the Duke liked her comment. Hanston sat at the table with everyone else, but his mind was far away. He was trying to think of a way to ask Daisy out unobtrusively. The Duke thought that it would be nice to take Daisy to places she would like to visit, but he glossed over the fact that he would probably not have the opportunity to ask her out. He began to tell me about the beautiful places of Pontifex with the look of a connoisseur, but he chose those where he needed an escort. They sat opposite each other, embarrassed by the situation. The girl looked at the Duke in surprise, who said that he would be happy to keep her company if she had a place she wanted to go. Before going to bed, Daisy sat in her room with her hands on her head, thinking about what had happened this afternoon. She recalled how the Duke said he had nothing to do and was asking her out. With her hands over her face, she blushed and wondered if the word had any other meaning. The next day, the girl brought a pile of paper and gave it to the Duke, who did not understand. But then, after looking at a few of the items she had written, he asked in surprise if these were the places she would like to visit. When he realized that she had been writing this all night, he couldn't stop laughing, which confused Daisy. Now they were both very happy. The Duke said they would go everywhere. They came to a coffee shop that was the only one in the kingdom with equipment for making pressurized coffee. Daisy showed it to the Duke, who was very interested. Rejoicing that the taste was excellent, she didn't even notice that she had left a foam mustache over her upper lip. Hanston looked at the girl with a smile, saying that she eats some strange things. Taking her cup in one hand because she offered to try it, he leaned in a little, running his free hand over her lips and wiping away her milky mustache. While tasting the coffee, the Duke blushed a little, making excuses that Daisy looked like Pieta at that moment, so he automatically reached out and wiped the foam away. She took a step, stumbled, and looked surprised to find herself in the Duke's arms. They were both embarrassed, but the Duke let the girl go and turned around and said that everything was fine, and they should go to another place on her list. Dion took the author's hand and they left the cafe together. Even his ears were red, but the Duke kept saying that she was still like Pieta, no matter how many times he told her to be careful. Daisy leaned on the bridge railing, literally hanging onto it and admiring the lake that everyone had recommended she see. She even forgot to ask herself if she could walk hand in hand with the Duke. Looking at how many emotions the lake evoked in her, Hanston realized that the girl was not lying. It was really her first time here. The Duke replied with a smile that it was possible, looking at how Daisy was enthusiastically pointing at the boat and wanting to ride it. Hanston was shaking with exertion because he had never thought that rowing was not as easy as it seems. The girl reached out and touched the Duke's forehead, checking to see if he had a fever. She really wanted to help, so she suggested that she would row herself and he could give her the oars. And when the Duke said that he was the one, the girl smiled and realized who Kashtanchik was so stubbornly in love with. He was sitting on a bench, resting and dripping with sweat when Daisy called his name. The Duke looked down at the girl in puzzlement as she came closer and put her hands on his shoulders. Hanston blushed when he realized that she was just shielding him from the sun to keep him from getting too hot. Taking her hand to keep Daisy from moving away, he still looked her in the eye and said that he was curious about something. He asked her if she remembered telling him about a character with brown hair that she had invented. The girl, folding her arms across her chest, thought that the second prince she had invented would meet Chestnut when he became emperor, and wondered if it was possible to prevent this. The Duke sat there, visibly gloomier than before, because the girl had asked him what he had asked, thinking too hard. Blushing, he looked away and covered his mouth with his hands when he asked her if she had any other options for her ideal type of man. But the girl thought he was talking about the writer's taste, now thinking about what the Duke had asked. Looking at the Duke, she knew that her ideal type in real life was a warm and gentle man, like the one sitting in front of her. Daisy quickly blushed while the Duke tried to understand why. Meanwhile, at the palace, Hardy was walking around in circles, wondering if the Duke would do something stupid and talk about something boring. Rhodason and Pieta knitted while sitting on the floor, and the little one asked the butler to stop walking back and forth because he was disturbing. While Hardy looked at my lady in confusion, she told Rhodason that it was too early to talk about her future mother, but it was definitely going to happen. The girls started hugging when Kashtanchik told Hardy that Rhodason was on their side because they were best friends. Rhodey asked why they were so worried because a walk is a good thing. He explained that he was worried that everything would go well on the walk. Smiling, Hardy realized that it didn't matter how it went, because Rothi was right, and sometimes it was enough that people were happy just being around each other. Rhodason asked with a twinkle in her eye if her friend would go to the festival, where they light lanterns and throw them into the sky. Folding her arms across her chest, the little girl said that she had been there 1,000,000 times and was not interested, which surprised the butler. Pieta flew away with her arms outstretched and called out to her nanny. She was very happy to see her again. Sitting down, the girl immediately caught the child in her arms and asked her with a smile if she had behaved well. The Duke rolled his eyes and told Hardy that they were back. He was very tired, and the bags under his eyes were very noticeable. Seeing in Hanston's eyes that they had a good time, the butler was happy, because now he could persuade him to go to the festival. Talking to Hardy, Daisy was inspired by the festival the boy was talking about, saying she would like to go there. The Duke pricked up his ears, standing a few steps behind. Smiling, he asked if they could go there together, since she was so eager to visit. Excited to be at the festival, the author began to play Pieta, who was happy to be there with her. Heidi thought that the first ideal option was the center of the beach, where the whole festival would be visible. The second option was the edge of the beach, where you could also watch the stars because they are best seen there. With his arms folded across his chest, he couldn't choose which place would be more suitable and lamented that it was difficult. But then he thought that these two could be seated on a sofa away from Pieta and Hardy himself, and they would be perfect in the middle of the beach. On the day of the festival, the Duke recalled that Pieta and Daisy had abandoned him, so now he asked his assistant where they were. Smiling, he learned about the center and the edge of the beach, deciding that his place was at the edge, so he said he would find it himself and not wait for Hardy. Hanston was smiling with satisfaction, because they had chosen a place at the deserted end of the beach. It was perfect. Hardy tried to catch his breath, leaning on his knees and asking the Duke what he was doing here, but he simply said he was late. The butler tried to explain to the Duke that this was the wrong place, saying that he should be sitting in the center of the beach and not here. As they descended, they looked at the multitude of people scurrying between the trees waiting for flashlights. Lanterns began to rise around the gazebo where the Hardys had recently been in Hanston, attracting the attention of everyone around. And while the Duke watched with everyone else, the butler did not feel very well. It was a complete failure of his plan. Now both upset, the Duke and the butler sat in the gazebo and looked in different directions. The strange girls noticed the gazebo and the two gentlemen there, whispering about who they were. Putting his hand on his head, the Duke, without looking at his servant, told him not to have any surprises next time. At the same time, Daisy and Pieta were admiring the beautiful view with their heads up to the sky. The little girl sat down in the arms of her surprised nanny, holding a bouquet of beautiful flowers that she had given to the girl. The nanny hugged Kashtanchik, saying that she was very happy that he had come to the event with her. The next day, Hardy brought a letter, interrupting the Duke and Daisy's conversation when he told them about it. There was also a letter for Daisy. The girl looked at the stamped envelope, wondering who could have sent her the letter. In her confusion and surprise, the girl even opened her mouth. The letter was sent by the first prince. Hardy stared at the letter Daisy was reading, wondering what it said. The girl looked up at the Duke, surprised to see that it was an invitation to a party. Daisy admitted that she really wanted to go to the party and, moreover, to ride horses, because the prince had offered such a ride. Although the Duke said it was a good offer, his face betrayed his emotions. He was clearly not happy with the prince's attention. Realizing that Dion was not happy, the girl now tried to tell him that he did not have to go when he suggested that they leave. Hanston said it would be nice to be at a party after a long break. Hardy almost dropped his jaw in surprise behind the Duke. The butler leaned over to the nanny with a smile, asking if she knew how to ride horses, while the Duke listened intently, his head turned to her. Now he smiled noticeably, looking at the girl and offering to teach her. Daisy looked in amazement at the party the prince had organized right on the beach by the sea, while the Duke remained a few steps behind her. She didn't even notice when he hurried up, now giving Daisy a hand to help her down from the horse. The first prince called out to Daisy with a smile, drawing her attention to him and thanking her for agreeing to come. As they began to bow, Glenn laughed and put his hand on the girl's shoulder, winking at her and telling her that there was no need for formality. Standing in front of the girl, the Duke thanked her for the invitation, looking a little angry. He was visibly jealous. But the prince didn't even notice, just smiling and saying that he was the one who should be thankful, because the Duke's presence ensured a full house at the party. The Duke and Daisy sat down at the table next to each other, looking at the huge amount of goodies on the table. But a few seconds later, their mouths dropped open in surprise as the prince took his seat at the head of the table, hands behind his head and leaning back in his chair. The prince said that his younger brother Edward remembered the girl's name because he was angry and huffing and puffing because she called him a baby. With a smile, he asked if the girl wanted to come play with the second prince, because he still thought she was friendly. Daisy could not believe what she was hearing. She could not believe that she would ever see Prince Edward again. At the same time, the Duke looked at the girl, waiting with bated breath for her answer. The prince continued to talk about how Edward would be pleased because he had been feeling very lonely in recent days. Hanston invited the two princes with a smile to his soon-to-be-completed palace in Bonus. He said that he would make an exception for them, although he never invited strangers. While the Duke looked at Daisy jealously as she sipped her tea, she thought that he wanted to take the little prince away from Chestnut, because Bonus was quite far away. Glenn was very pleased with the invitation, saying that he would not miss this opportunity, as he was invited by the Duke of Hanston himself. Everyone at the party was about the same age, and they couldn't get enough of Daisy because she was teaching the Duke's daughter and complimenting her. Although she agreed, she was only thinking that the only thing the girl had learnt in front of her was how to fold origami into the shape of a pumpkin. While Daisy was thinking that she was hungry and that it was wrong to take the goodies first, the Duke was looking at her carefully. And then he gently began to put several, in his opinion, delicious cakes on the plate with tongs. The girl looked at him in surprise as he placed the plate in front of her, thinking only that everyone was looking at them. Seeing this scene and the way everyone was staring at the Duke and Daisy, the first prince began to laugh, drawing attention to himself and asking why no one had touched the cakes that had been prepared especially for them. The girl looked at the prince while he kept her attention on himself and talked about cakes and the famous lemon pie. She also started to eat, trying some incredibly delicious cake first. Riding a horse and entering the sea, Daisy couldn't help but be happy. She felt like she was floating on waves. But the Duke, who approached her, asked her to stay a little further away from the water. But the very next moment she was about to fall off the horse when something hit her leg. She was frightened. A girl on the horse that had hit Daisy's horse rode up to the confused Hanston, smiled sweetly and greeted him. Dion said with an indifferent expression that the girl should not be too close to him on the horse, so he asked her to move away. The prince asked the surprised Daisy with a smile if she was all right when she turned to him, hearing his voice. He had also seen this situation. All smiles. Glenn said that he had been watching her for a long time and that there was something special about Daisy. The girl's horse stood on its haunches and she clung to the reins to keep herself in the saddle. The Duke called out to her in fright, looking at what was happening. The girl was sitting in the water, albeit shallow, all wet and scared. And when everyone empathized with her, the girl who was approaching the Duke put her hand to her mouth, smiling broadly. But she shrieked and recoiled a little when Prince Glenn, who was now soaked to the skin, plunged into the water next to her. Fixing his hair, the guy laughed and said that it was really very refreshing. The servants shouted, calling for the prince and being afraid for him, but he just said that he was fine. The Duke threw a towel over her shoulders, asking if she was all right and if she was injured. She looked at Dion in surprise, saying that his clothes would get wet if he sat next to her like that. Taking Daisy in his arms, the Duke looked at the prince, asking if he was okay. And while the prince was surrounded by servants who were concerned about his well-being and health, Hanston told the girl that she had to change her clothes first. Once again, they attracted too much attention and everyone was burning holes in the Duke's back with their eyes, whispering that he was carrying a girl in his arms. The prince was also watching, but he was upset that it was not he who was carrying Daisy Heidi and that it was the Duke who allowed her to take her out of the water. When the prince was saying goodbye to the guests, he was called and turned to see Daisy and Dion, who were wearing different clothes and were also about to say goodbye. The prince thanked them both with a smile for coming, saying that he was the one to thank for the day. The author, bowing her head, thanked the prince for saving her today and apologized for it. He tried to pretend that he didn't understand what she was talking about, but Daisy knew. She said he had fallen into the water on purpose. Blushing and scratching the back of his head, Prince Glenn looked away and said it was only a nightly duty. Arriving and wanting to see Pieta, the Duke and Daisy are frightened when they hear crying coming from the room. The nanny tried to calm the girl down by touching her cheeks, when she told her that the pumpkin had fallen off her hoop. The adults breathed a sigh of relief when they heard that the girl was fine. Looking at his daughter, the Duke said that this is why he always reminds her how important it is to take care of the things she cares about. The little girl began to sob even more because she had not listened to her father, and Daisy turned her head to him, a little angry with the Duke. Stroking Chestnut's hair while he cried, the nanny said that everything was fine and that the pumpkin could be reattached. Now the girl was hugging the nanny, saying that she was the best because she would fix the broken hoop, and Daisy was smiling sincerely as she hugged the child. She handed the hoop to the master, who told her it was possible and said it would take him 4 days. As she left the workshop, she thought that Pieta would be happy to know that her item would be repaired and wondered if she should buy her some pumpkin cookies to cheer her up. But a few seconds later, she was scared to death when someone said boo and put his hands on her shoulders. When she turned, she saw the first prince, who raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture and began to apologize. Daisy started to bow while the prince asked if she was in good health, but he started to stop her, surprised at what she was doing. Glenn closed her mouth before she could say anything and put his finger to his lips. He asked the girl to be quiet, because the aristocrats he knew would not let him in. They talked about where Daisy was, and the prince heard that she was on her way home. When he found out that she had nothing to do, he asked her with a smile if she would like to have lunch with him, while Daisy clutched the strap of her handbag tightly. The prince laughed when she asked if he wanted her to go with him to the palace. He said that he had escaped from there and was not going to return so soon. He said with a pleased look that he would say, if he was caught, that she had nothing to do with his escape, when Daisy shouted out that she did. Blushing a little, the prince looked at the girl in front of him and asked her to join him for lunch. She agreed with a smile and the prince was overjoyed. Walking along, the prince told me that he knew a place not far from here and that she would definitely like it. With a sly smile, the girl thought that the prince must have run away from the palace a lot, otherwise he wouldn't know the area so well. She took the prince away from the Shanu restaurant where she used to work so that no one would notice her there, and led the bewildered prince somewhere he would enjoy it more. When they were already in the restaurant, the girl smiled and said that her hobby was to look for where the best food was, when the prince said that he would not have thought that this would be her favorite place. Smiling broadly, the prince said that he also liked the tasty houses, as she called them, where delicious food was prepared. The boy began to tell her that everything in the palace was monotonous, and even the food was losing its taste, while Daisy listened attentively. Looking at the menu, the prince chose what he could order, opting for the dish of the day: beef. She looked up at the guy, thinking that he didn't even look at the whole menu, but immediately looked at the dish of the day, so he goes to restaurants a lot. She expertly explained to the surprised Glenn that the dish of the day was a product that was about to expire, so he had to order something else. In order not to answer the prince's question about how she knew, the girl quickly found a pork dish and immediately turned her attention to it, pointing to the dish on the menu. The prince said with a smile and a little blush that he had no reason to refuse. Having tasted the dish Daisy ordered, the prince began to praise the taste because it was really incredible. While they were eating, they talked, and the girl asked, stating that he really uses the name Ren when he leaves the palace. Leaning over, Glenn whispered in the girl's ear, who was listening intently, that Ren was part of his full name, Brent. She started to laugh, but then became serious again, looking at the guy and not understanding why he was looking at her like that. She replied that he could indeed ask her something personal, but she was surprised and could not understand what he wanted to ask. Daisy choked on her tea when the prince asked if she had a special relationship with the duke, embarrassed by the question. When she turned her head to him, the guy was serious, asking her the same question again, whether she had a special relationship with the duke. He began to explain that he and the duke appear together a lot, and they live in the same house. When the author told him that she lived nearby so that her lady could study better, the prince surprised her by asking if they had only a working relationship. She recalled that they had recently been on a date when he took her to a bridge she had always wanted to visit. Then she thought that her heartbeat quickened when she saw him, and remembered the moment when she stood opposite him after a boat trip. She was a little embarrassed when she looked at the prince, because she thought that, despite all this, she and the duke were not close. Daisy looked at Glenn in surprise when he said he was asking too many questions, laughed, and poured her tea into her cup. As soon as the nanny returned, the girl immediately rushed to meet her, asking why she had taken so long and whether she had managed to repair her gift. Mala was very happy that her bezel would be as good as new when Daisy assured her of this. And now Pieta was pulling her nanny's hand to show her something. She was surprised to see the Hardys sitting together and very busy with something. They showed Daisy an incredibly beautiful house made of sweets, but they were just about to add a chocolate door. The girl was surprised when Hardy stretched and told her that my lady had been crying while they were building everything, and the duke was trying to carefully nail the door in. When she realized that they had built this house to distract Pieta, the nanny apologized to the girl, saying that she was late and had met someone in the city. When the duke asked who she had seen, Daisy began to tell him that she had accidentally met Prince Glenn. Hearing this, Daeon could not help but react and now looked at what he had done in confusion. He was holding a broken chocolate door from the house. Hardy and Daisy began to calm the child down as she screamed hysterically through the door. The duke was sitting in his seat, thinking about his own business and looking at a single point in front of him. The butler looked at the duke with pity, realizing that he would never have thought how he would suffer from unrequited love. While Hanston was saying that the prince was an unusual person for running away from the palace, sarcastically of course, Hardy said with a smile that Daisy must have liked it too. The duke propped his head up with his hand and was embarrassed, but he nevertheless asked the butler if he was really so callous. And then Hardy began to emotionally tell the duke to say what was in his heart, whether it was bad or good emotions. The duke looked at Hardy steadily when he asked what he would do if Daisy fell in love with Prince Glenn. At the same time, although it was late in the day, a letter with a red mark was delivered to the duke's estate, signifying the urgency of the message. While getting dressed the next morning, the duke kept thinking about the words of Hardy, who sang the praises of Prince Glenn yesterday. Hanston had already gone outside where his carriage was waiting for him. He was going to Bernice. Daisy followed, holding her shawl around her shoulders. She said with a smile and a little embarrassment that she would do everything possible to prevent the second prince and Pieta from meeting, because she thought that was what he was worried about. The girl was surprised to find herself in the duke's strong but gentle arms. Stroking her hair, he promised that he would come home as soon as possible. Hugging the author and feeling her clutching his clothes, he told her out loud that he would miss her. Sitting at the dining room table, the girl did not pay attention to Pieta, who was eating next to her, thinking only about what the duke had said to her before he left. To distract herself a little, she stroked Kashtanchik's hair, which made her smile. But then she looked at the girl in surprise, blushing a little, and said that Daisy was just like her dad. Hardy brought the letter to the even more surprised girl, while the little girl thought that her father had written it. When the butler saw that the letter was from the prince, he didn't beat around the bush and asked directly what the girl had to do with the prince. Hardy said that they could not refuse the prince, but the timing was not good because the duke was not there, and he wanted to stop by on his way back because he was on business. The guy looked like a devil when he said that the prince was probably busy, and they should buy him a cup of tea and show him out. Before they could agree, Hardy shouted that the prince was already here, and Daisy looked around in confusion. As soon as the prince got out of the carriage, Daisy curtsied, saying that she was glad to see him and that it was an honor for the whole family. They exchanged pleasantries, and the prince immediately apologized if he had embarrassed her with his pronunciation, but she only replied that she was not at all embarrassed, although she lied. A few seconds later, the prince started laughing out loud, asking if it was true because he saw her expression. The servants who accompanied the first prince did not understand what was happening, wondering how the future monarch was behaving. But suddenly Prince Edward got out of the back of the carriage, wiping sweat from his forehead and saying that it was not easy. Glenn was surprised to see his brother. His servant was confused as to how he got there, and Daisy couldn't believe that the little prince was on their estate, because it was not according to plan. Pieta was looking out the window, holding her favorite toy in her hand and asking herself who the hell that was. The first prince began to swear at his brother, asking him where he had come from. The boy happily said that he had climbed into the box when his brother had already got into the carriage, and no one had noticed him. The elder prince ordered the boy to be taken to the palace immediately, while he stood as if he was going to fight the servants. But Edward climbed up on one of the lampposts, clinging to it with his hands and feet, saying that he was not going anywhere. And while all the servants were trying to unhook him from the lantern, Glenn folded his arms across his chest and looked at his brother with anger in his eyes. The second prince returned to his brother with tears in his eyes, saying that he had been gone all day and was being taught difficult manners. Daisy tried to pull herself together and think only about Chestnut, because she was the priority, but she felt sorry for the little guy. It was clear that Glenn was angry because his brother was trying to bargain for a different solution, but he was adamant. Tearfully, Edward held onto the lantern as his older brother pulled on his legs, trying to unhook him and send him home. One of the governesses happily told Pieta, who did not share her joy, that this boy was the second prince. Edward held onto his brother's legs, sobbing hysterically. Chestnut was unhappy about who had come to visit Daisy, looking at him and then at the man the governess had called a prince. The girl tried to restrain Pieta when she wanted to run out of the room, furious with anger. She was supposed to stay in her room today. Edward stared at the sword hanging on the wall, asking if it was the one used by the Duke, and Hardy replied with a smile that it was. The girl recalled Dion's face and smile, who also said that it was better to change the plot rather than hide the girl from all the male characters. Sitting down next to the boy, Daisy offered him a biscuit. He and Hardy high-fived each other, pleased with themselves because it is so easy to make a child happier just by giving them a cookie. Prince Edward said it was good, but the biscuits tasted much better than he allowed himself to say. While his brother was eating the biscuits, Glenn said he had come to talk to Daisy, which surprised her. Hardy was standing behind the prince and was angry when the first prince said that he had stopped by to ask the girl to recommend him some more restaurants with good food. When the girl said she would share, even though she doesn't tell anyone about her favorite places, he was happy. With a smile, he moved closer, suggesting that they go to one of these places together. Daisy was surprised by the proposal, looking at the prince while Hardy almost exploded with emotion behind her. The butler started coughing, forcing the girl to turn to him and ask if he was okay. He apologized for his cough and mentally begged the Duke to come back soon. Glenn apologized with a smile for the unplanned visit and thanked us for hosting him. Prince Edward, leaving the cookies behind, asked sadly if they were going home. Taking the girl by the skirt, the boy looked up at her, asking her to go with them to the palace. He added that this was an order. But the very next moment, Pieta ran at him, who would never have let the nanny go anywhere with these two. Mala was angry, looking at her opponent and saying as if she had cut her off, "Daisy is not going anywhere." She also added that they should go back to their house. Daisy shouted that you can't behave like that because he's a prince. Chestnut did not care that the prince was crying in front of her. She angrily asked him who he was to take Daisy away from her, and called him a baby. Finally, the governess appeared, and the author quickly handed Pieta to her, saying that she was leaving her in her care. Hardy, taking the crying prince in his arms and asking him with a smile if he would like to see the stamp collection belonging to the Duke. Daisy was still standing in the position where she was holding Chestnut when the children were taken to different rooms, and Glenn was laughing heartily. The nanny bowed and apologized for the disrespect she had shown the prince, while the older brother looked at her again in surprise. But Glenn laughed again, saying that it was all right because they were just kids. He looked at the girl in front of him with a look that left her with questions, but he said that she was amazing, and he wanted to know everything about her. Daisy thought it was about Pieta, because they were talking about her, so she explained with a smile that it was because of her hair, because she had short hair. But her smile immediately disappeared when the prince said that he did not mean the child. The prince, changing the subject, asked Daisy when she planned to come to the palace, which surprised her once again, and she even asked him what he was talking about. He explained that then Edward would leave him alone, and most importantly, he would also like to see the girl again. Glenn blushed a little as he looked at her and smiled sweetly. In bonus, the Duke asked what his servant was saying when he said that he had received a letter asking the prince to pay a visit to the estate. With his hands folded in front of him, Hanston thought about what the servant had told him. The prince had been at his house yesterday, and he had no idea. Dismissing the servant, he took his cloak and left the office. When they finally saw the two princes off, Daisy immediately held Chestnut in her arms. Hugging the girl, the nanny asked her why she was behaving so badly, but the girl replied that that kid wanted to take her away. The little girl replied that she did not like him immediately, while she thought about how to keep them away from each other, because she could not directly tell her not to treat the prince badly. Sitting down next to the girl, Daisy stroked her hair with a laugh when she said she had to look after the nanny. In the evening, Pieta was depressed, saying that it was already evening and her father hadn't sent a letter, even though it was unlike him. While the girl was crying that her dad might have forgotten, Daisy said that she had grown up and that her dad could now travel a little further away from home, which caught Chestnut's attention. Hugging her nanny, the little girl said that as long as she was there, everything was fine. Daisy, putting Pieta to bed, said that tomorrow she would get a letter from her dad, but that she had to go to bed tonight because it was getting late. After leaving the girl's room, Daisy hid behind a column in surprise, looking questioningly at the figure wandering around the palace at such a late hour. She was looking at a tall figure in a black cloak, his face hidden under a hood. She put her hand to her mouth and pampered her eyes as she dismissed one theory after another. The servants were asleep. And Hardy. It couldn't be Dion. Bursting into the room, the nanny shouted for Pieta to run away, pressing against the door from inside the room. But she was soon gagged. She was very frightened, but under the hood she saw a familiar face. It was the Duke after all. Dion scratched the back of his head in embarrassment when the girl asked if he shouldn't be in bonus. When she saw that his clothes were all wet and he was driving at night, she put her hand to her mouth and asked him if something had happened. Dion took the girl's hand, telling her that this was not what she had thought and that the help Hardy was about to call for was not needed. He asked the girl to wait in the room for a few minutes because he needed to wash himself from the road. When he returned, blushing a little, the Duke asked the author not to wake anyone while he was waiting for her. Wearing a blanket and with tea served to him by Daisy, the Duke thanked her with a smile as he sat in front of the fireplace. She turned her head to the side, embarrassed because she was looking at his lips, and asked if Dion had left Bonus yesterday, to which he replied that he had at midnight. She couldn't believe it, because he had been traveling for a day without sleep. They looked at each other while Daisy tried to show him that the Duke needed to rest by rolling her eyes. Without looking at Daisy, he changed the subject to the guests at their home, although he was unhappy that they were talking about the prince and that he was even here. Folding her arms across her chest, she said she almost died of fear when Prince Edward came out. His mind was completely blown, and Hanston turned to Daisy, asking if she had really spoken about the second prince. They talked about what had happened, and the Duke thanked her for hosting the guests in his absence and asked about Hardy, mentioning the butler. Sitting together, the author told us that Pieta would be writing to Rhodason, and that she had recently said that the nanny looked like her father. But all the girl's joy disappeared when she heard that the Duke would have to return to Bonus, because he had not yet finished his business there. She started to apologize, shouting because he was leaving tomorrow morning, and he hadn't rested and hadn't slept for more than a day. However, as soon as Daisy tried to get up from the sofa, the Duke caught her hand and held it close to his side. The girl turned to him in surprise. He asked me to stay with him a little longer and then put his head on her shoulder. Both of them were red as crayfish. They sat together in front of the fireplace until the Duke fell asleep without realizing it. Daisy also didn't notice how she fell asleep next to the Duke. They were both sleeping without their hind legs. Opening her eyes, the girl looked at Dion, who was sleeping, calm and sweet, and he was lying too close. The little girl stood in the room, arms outstretched, happy that her dad and Daisy were awake. Hardy, who was standing next to me, was very happy. He said they were doing well, but they needed to do even better. Pieta ran to her nanny and dad, while the two of them blushed again at the embarrassment of the situation, and sat on opposite sides of the sofa. Sitting in class, Prince Edward was thinking about how bored he was, and his brother was writing a letter to Daisy as usual. When the boy heard about the crown princess and that his brother was to get married soon, he dropped his pen in surprise. The boy thought about what the teacher had said about inviting a wife to live in the palace. If his brother was going to marry, it would have to be a very Daisy. Looking at another letter, Hardy could not understand why the prince was trying so hard to invite Daisy to the palace. The butler shrieked inwardly. Is Daisy already waiting for letters from the first prince? What if she likes him? Folding his arms across his chest, he thought that it would be better for the girl to go to the palace so that the prince could finally calm down. But a few days later, looking at the carriage that came to pick her up, Hardy realized with fear that he had been wrong. Pieta appeared next to him and asked where her nanny was going today. Hardy lied about his business because he had a picture in his mind of how my lady would behave if she found out that Daisy was going to the imperial palace. The girl quickly changed into her pumpkin clothes and looked around to see if anyone was around to notice her. Two men in beautiful clothes bowed to the girl, welcoming her to the palace. She thought that when she had been here for the ball, she hadn't even noticed how beautiful the emperor's palace was. Prince Glenn appeared in front of her almost immediately, greeting her with a smile and asking how she had traveled. He also admitted that he had been waiting for her. Daisy bowed in greeting and said she was glad to see him too. The prince pulled back his collar, showing his neck and saying that he had been looking at the gate for so long, stretching it out, that his neck had become longer. Laughing into her fist, Daisy joked that the prince had grown a little taller now. The young man, who was standing next to his brother, bowed to the girl and greeted Lady Heidi, saying that she must have had a long journey and asked her to make herself at home. The first prince laughed out loud when his brother finished his monologue, but as he came closer, Edward asked her to go inside as quickly as possible and volunteered to accompany her. She bent down, offering her hand to the little prince to help him as he had offered. However, she turned in puzzlement to a voice she would have recognized at any time. Pieta ran towards her, shouting "Daisy," frightening all the servants who were standing nearby. Holding out her arms to the girl, she asked her why she had climbed out of the luggage compartment and how she could have ended up here in the first place. Putting her hand to her forehead, the author could not believe that Kashtanchik had done the same thing as Edward had done a few days earlier. The little girl would apologize with a guilty look on her face and say she wouldn't do it again, when her nanny was nervous because she knew they would be in trouble when the Duke found out. The prince approached her, offering to send a letter to the Duke of Hanston just in case, so that he would not worry about his daughter. However, their conversation about the letter was interrupted by Edward, who pointed at the girl and shouted, recognizing her. He shouted that a person who had no manners could not be in the palace, especially since she dared to cross his threshold without an invitation. The two children were set against each other because they didn't get along from the very beginning, and Daisy, looking at the two, didn't know what to do. Pieta, pointing her finger at the prince, said that he was much shorter than Rhodasen, and that she was even shorter than Pieta herself, and laughed. Pointing his finger at the girl, Edward asked his brother to send her back because she was always insulting him, and they didn't even have her name. Chestnut bowed, greeting Prince Glenn and politely introducing herself to him by her full name. And then she looked up at the prince with the sweetest look, asking if she could join the tour of the palace. The first prince left the girl in the palace, saying that she could check for herself if they had pumpkins, while his little brother was angry behind his back. Turning to the boy, he asked them both not to quarrel because they had invited Lady Daisy to have a good time at the palace and scandals were not part of the invitation. The girl looked at the prince with gratitude, thanking him with words. They both exhaled a sigh of relief as they understood each other, and how difficult it was for them to cope with children Edward's age at Pieta's. While Edward was trying to talk smugly about the horses, the little girl ran to them to the prince and Nanny's sincere surprise. Smiling, the prince said that my lady was not afraid of anything, and asked her if she wanted to go for a ride. To keep the secret, Glenn whispered in the girl's ear, telling her that in fact his younger brother was still afraid of horses. One of the servants who passed by laughed and said that Glenn had been with horses since he was a child, and the old man had been chasing him, and that's why his knees hurt now. And the prince said he would bring him the best medicine. The author was surprised to see the prince communicating so freely and informally with the groom. Laughing, but a little embarrassed, the guy asked if she thought he was behaving strangely. She began to frantically justify that this was not the case, and that such communication was simply a novelty for her. Turning back to the kid, he said that he had a lot of responsibility on his shoulders because of his brother, and it was getting harder for him to ignore it and his many responsibilities. He said that he needed to become someone whom his brother would trust without limit, because usually the throne is a place of loneliness. With her eyes pampered, she thought that if Edward took the throne, everything would be like in a novel, and all her and the Duke's efforts would be in vain. The prince felt guilty because he thought he had confused her with his problems. However, when Daisy replied that this was not the case, he plucked up the courage to ask her out, which she accepted with a simple, "Yep." But as soon as she realized what the prince had said, she screamed, asking the happy Glenn what he had just said. He happily told me that he had recently received a letter from the Duke of Hanston, who promised to invite him to visit as soon as he had completed all his business. He whispered in her ear that he had learned from the servants about many interesting places in Bonus, so she had to go with him. But the girl was too confused by all this. Glancing at him, Daisy thought that the prince would always know her tastes, and perhaps that was why she felt comfortable around him. But as she looked at him, she couldn't stomach the fact that he had asked her out. It was too much. Pieta, who was riding a swing, was approached respectfully by Edward, who called her "Hey you," and told her not to address Lady Daisy by her first name. With his arms folded across his chest, he was angry because the girl was ignoring him, so he played his last card. He told her to stop calling the princess by her first name. Chestnut stopped riding on the swing and now stood in front of the prince, just as angry as he was. They started arguing, and the little girl asked him why he thought she would become a princess. Clenching his hands into fists and no longer holding back, Edward asserted that this was an order from His Majesty. Pieta calmly said that His Majesty had made a mistake, or had made the prince even angrier. He could not believe she dared to say such things. Looking very sweet and innocent, the girl said that Daisy was actually her mother. When asked by the prince, she returned to the swing, where she now sat respectfully, and said that it would officially happen in about 20 days. And while Glenn rejoiced that the two had finally gotten along, Daisy couldn't take her eyes off the children. remembering everything she had tried to save Pieta from. The prince could not understand where the girl was hovering, because she did not respond to his remark about children and their whims, thinking about something of her own and looking away. When they arrived home, they were met by a frightened and at the same time angry Hardy, who immediately called out to my lady and ran to meet her. Hugging the surprised girl, the butler told her not to do that again because he was scared to death. As she hugged Hardy, she apologized, thinking that everything would be fine, because she had left a letter telling him where she had gone. They swore on their little fingers that it would never happen again. When the butler leaned his ear towards the girl, she whispered her request to him. Holding the paper Hardy gave her in her hand, the girl asked if she should put the letter in an envelope and give it to him. After he said he would send the letter tomorrow with a messenger, they both smiled broadly and Pieta thanked him for his help. Holding the paper, she was excited to write her first letter to her father, and it was an exciting moment for her. She started drawing letters with pencils, first of all greeting her father in the letter and asking how he was doing. Sitting in his study in Bonus, the Duke carefully read his daughter's letter about her visit to the palace, her meeting with the first prince, and her seeing the short man, his brother. A few days after he received the letter, he was standing by the window and was distracted because the butler said he had prepared refreshments. The old man, who admired the Duke, said that Daisy and Pieta must have passed through the forest and would be here soon. They stood outside the castle. The butler was surprised when the Duke simply folded his arms across his chest and looked tiredly in front of him. The first person to run out to him in his fantasy was his daughter, who greeted him with joy and ran to hug him. He also saw Daisy raise her hand in greeting, showing that she was happy to see him. He even closed his eyes and smiled, even though it gave away even more how tortured and tired he was. Prince Glenn got out of the carriage, lamenting that they had finally arrived. The Duke was surprised to see the prince, but bowed politely to welcome him to the castle. But he was angry. You could see it for only a few seconds. His eyes were bloodshot because he did not understand why the prince was here. Daisy looked out of the carriage and called his name and greeted him. She was happy to see the Duke. She asked him with interest how he was doing, coming closer. Trying to filter what he was saying, the Duke asked why he and the prince were together. He calmly replied that his brother was ill, so he could not come. When he heard that his daughter had not come because many people were ill, he tried his best to remain polite and wished Prince Edward a speedy recovery. Smiling, Daisy remembered that she had a present for the Duke, so she reached into her purse to give it to him. She handed over the bag and the letter, saying that the first was from her and the letter was from Pieta. Afterwards, the Duke with the poker face watched the two of them talking about some tea, and the prince asked if she really liked it too. Looking at all this, the Duke was angry. He remembered the lines of his daughter's letter he had received a few days ago, in which she had said that the little boy had said that Daisy would become a princess, and that it was His Majesty's order.